Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 1. The child arrived in a mail wagon. It was a late afternoon in the early spring. Bill Remmer was busy planting rose seedlings all day long. "Are you Mr. Bill Remmer?" Standing with a dazed look on her face, the child asked a cautious question. Her smooth pronunciation gave off a strange feeling. "Yes. I am indeed Bill Remmer." Bill took off his straw hat with the same hands that had dusted off the dirt from his clothes. When the tanned face, which had been hidden by the shadow of his straw hat, was revealed, the startled child swallowed her saliva. The child's reaction was nothing out of the ordinary for Bill. Anyone who first saw Bill Remmer generally reacted like the child because of his rough-looking appearance. "Who are you?" Bill's face grew more terrifying as he frowned upon the child. "Hello, Uncle Bill. I am Leyla Lewellin. I came from Lovida." The child enunciated clearly and slowly. "Lovida, huh?" Bill realized why her pronunciation sounded rather strange. "You're saying, you crossed the border into the Berg Empire all by yourself?" "Yes. I rode the train." The child smiled awkwardly and unnaturally straightened her posture. The mailman who had brought the child approached the two from behind. "Ah. This child finally met you, Mr. Remmer. Good timing. What made you bring this child?" "This child was walking alone in front of the station, so I asked her where she was going and she said she was on her way to find Bill Remmer, the gardener of the Herhardt family. I brought her here because I was on my way to deliver some letters." The mailman replied with a smile and handed an envelope to Bill Remmer. It was a letter from a distant relative living in the neighboring country of Lovida. Bill urgently tore open the envelope on the spot. The letter contained the story of a child who was an orphan and was taken in by relatives who were now no longer able to foster her due to their supposed poor circumstances. The child's name was Leyla Lewellin. The little girl standing in front of Bill was the orphan. "Damn people. They sure are telling me this news fast." Bill lost his breath in amazement. No one in Lovida could take care of this mere orphan. Bill Remmer was the last among those who had a faint connection with the child. The letter stated that if Bill's situation was not favorable, he should leave the child in the orphanage. Bill muttered a curse and threw the crumpled paper to the floor. "These people should go to hell. How can they send this little thing here alone?" Now that Bill understood the whole situation, his face gradually turned red with anger. The child was treated like a bomb that was passed back and forth from one relative to another and meant to be thrown away when no one else wanted her. She was ultimately sent away to a different country with an address of a distant relative she did not even know of. "Excuse me, Uncle Bill. I am not that young." The child, who had been silently watching Bill, suddenly opened her mouth. "I'll be 12 in a couple of weeks," she whispered in a rather grown-up tone. Bill chuckled in amazement. He was relieved that she was older than he thought. The child looked smaller than her age. When the mailman who delivered the troublesome girl left, the two were left in the garden. Bill wrapped his head around with his hands and pleaded God for help. Even though they were distant relatives, the two seemed more like father and daughter from afar. Bill had never met his distant relatives for more than 20 years, and yet, there he was, stuck with a child who he never knew existed until today. Even though the weather was chilly, the child wore a thin layer of clothes. She was emaciated like an iron skewer. All Bill could see of her was her vivid green eyes and gold-threaded hair. It was impossible for him to take care of her, Bill concluded. But the only solution left was to put her in an orphanage, which drove him crazy. Bill once again murmured a curse towards the relatives that put him into this mess. The child flinched and started biting her red lips. "Follow me." Bill shook his head in frustration and led the way. "Let's fill our stomachs before I make my decision." His blunt words were carried away by the evening breeze. As the two walked further towards Bill's cabin, the child's timid steps gradually became light and cheerful. "Tilda, is that all you're eating?" Bill frowned upon the small plate the child was holding. "Yes. I eat a little." The child smiled. "Child, I hate children who don't eat a lot." The child's eyes widened at Bill's words. The light of the table lamp lit over the child's skinny wrist that was revealed under the carelessly raised sleeve. "You should eat everything like a cow." Bill's expression became more stern. The troubled Leyla, slowly blinking her eyes, moved more loaf of meat and bread onto her plate. She then hurriedly began to gobble up her food. "I can't eat like a cow, but I do eat quite well, uncle." The girl brightly smiled with breadcrumbs near her dainty lips. "Yes. I can definitely see that." Bill laughed and started filling his tall glass with alcohol. "Aren't you afraid of me?" Bill scrunched his face to deliberately scare the child. The child simply stared at the man, not daring to avoid his eyes. "No. You don't yell at me. You give me lots of good food. So I think you're a good person." What kind of life has this child been living? Bill thought as he filled his glass of beer again. The letter said the child's mother abandoned her husband and child to elope with another man. The father of the child, who was heartbroken by the betrayal, became an alcohol addict and had died of alcohol poisoning. After that, the child grew up in the homes of her relatives, only left to be deserted by them. Even though the child had a pitiful past, Bill believed it was still absurd to raise her. Bill Remmer chugged down the glass of beer and decided that he will make his decision by next week. Tilda, did everyone hear? The gardener Bill Remmer has started to raise a young girl. A young maid hurriedly rushed into the lounge servants use during their free time. The servants who were taking their rest all turned their eyes toward the young maid. A girl? Mr. Remmer? It would be more plausible to say that he decided to raise a lion or an elephant instead. One of the servants snorted. The Herhardt household's gardener, Bill Remmer, was a man who had a natural talent for growing flowers. Thanks to his talent, he has been able to maintain this position as a gardener for 20 years even with his brusque temper. He was deeply trusted by the Herhardt family, especially Norma. Due to Norma's unique love of flowers, she gave infinite understanding and tolerance to Bill's gardening and temper. It was also her decision to give the gardener a cabin in the woods located behind the Herhardt's mansion. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. Bill Remmer's life was simple. He worked in the garden and took a rest in the cabin. Despite his time drinking with his fellow workers, he spent most of his time surrounded by flowers and trees. Even after decades had passed ever since his wife died of an illness, he did not get close to any woman. The Bill Remmer raising a little girl? The servants who were resting in the lounge reached a consensus deeming that the rumor was nonsense until one of the maids sitting by the window burst into an exclamation. "Oh my! It must be true. Look over there." The maid pointed over the glass window with her eyes wide open. The servants all at once rushed over to the window and soon became shocked with wonder. On the other side of the garden, Bill Remmer was gardening with his body crouched down and the rumored petite girl was following his footsteps. The girl's golden hair, braided in one strand, shook back and forth like a pendulum as she trotted along. "I still haven't made my decision." When there were questions asked about the child, Bill repeatedly answered the same response. "I can't leave her here, so I need to think well." While Bill's thoughts continued through spring, then to summer, Leyla Lewellin was slowly settling down on the Herhardt estate. The child's diligent stroll through the gardens and forests had already become a familiar scene for the Herhardt servants. "I think she's grown a bit." Mrs. Mona, the Herhardt's chef, smiled while looking out the window. Leyla was examining the grass and flowers that were beginning to bud behind the forest cabin. "She's got a long way to go. She's still smaller than average girls." "Look, Bill Remmer. Kids are different than your plants. They can't grow overnight." Mrs. Mona shook her head as she lowered her basket down on the table. "What's this?" "Cookies and cake. There was a tea party yesterday at the mansion." "I hate sweets." "Really? This is Layla's." Bill Remmer's dark eyebrows wrinkled at Mrs. Mona's nonchalant response. This child was not meant to be here, and yet, the Duke's servants began to look after Leyla every day. They greeted her, brought her food, and sometimes visited her. It was becoming troublesome for Bill Remmer. "You should buy her some clothes. The young lady's skirt seems like it will go up to her knees." Mrs. Mona tisked as she stared at Leyla running after a bird. Bill failed to refute. Even in his eyes, it seemed obvious that Leyla was wearing clothes that didn't fit her. "Oh my! Oh my! Look at her!" Just when Mrs. Mona was about to leave, she suddenly pointed towards Leyla and shouted in dismay. Bill glanced at where Mrs. Mona was looking towards with a queer look. When the bird Leyla was chasing after landed on a tree branch, she started to swiftly climb up the tree. Her movements were athletic and light like a squirrel. She sure has a talent for climbing trees. Mrs. Mona scowled at Bill's unconcerned reply. Bill Remmer. You knew about her climbing trees and you let that go? How the hell are you raising your child? She's growing strong and well, as you can see. You're raising that girl like a wild beast. My God. Mrs. Mona raised her voice and made a fuss as Bill snooped around the window deafeningly. Leyla perched on the thin branch and watched the many birds playing on the thicket. After watching over the girl for a couple of months, Leyla Lewellin was proven to be a curious child who wanted to know more about the world. Flowers and grass, birds and insects. Anything that caught her eyes amazed and piqued her interest. One day at night, when Leyla wasn't returning for dinner, Bill had gone deep into the forest to find Leyla sitting by the river looking at a flock of water birds. She was so focused that she couldn't even hear Bill calling her name again and again. After spitting out a couple of more harsh lectures, Mrs. Mona had returned home. Bill had slowly walked out to the back of his cabin. Uncle. Leyla delightedly waved towards him. The child, who came down from the tree as quickly as she went up, hurriedly dashed towards Bill. The dull gray one-piece dress Leyla was wearing had short sleeves and was ragged. Her hand-me-down-like clothes seemed inappropriate when meeting the Duke, so Bill had made his decision to buy her new clothes. Get ready and come out, Bill said impulsively when the two arrived in front of the back door cabin. Ah. Uncle, we're going downtown to buy some clothes so you don't have to look so puzzled. Bill awkwardly gave off a dry cough and scratched his back neck. Duke Herhardt will be here soon, so it'll be a bit weird to greet him with your state right now. By the Duke? You mean the owner of this land, right? Yes. Since it's break, he'll be back. Break? Does the Duke attend school? Leyla frowned as she tilted her head. Bill grinned and stroked the child's disheveled hair. The Duke is only 18 years old, so he has no choice but to attend school. What? 18 years old? The Duke? Bill's laughter grew louder at the child's stunned expression. The child's fluffy hair that Bill had touched with his rough fingertips was as soft as cotton. A train from the capital had entered the platform at the Carlsbad station. The waiting servants approached the private section of the station. By the time they lined up in a straight posture, a tall, slim boy descended onto the platform. Hello, master. Starting with the polite greeting of the butler Hessen, all the other servants soon bowed their heads towards the boy. With a straight and graceful manner, Matthias responded to their greetings with a light but silent salute. His rosy lips were curled up in a smile that was neither excessive nor insufficient. It wasn't until Matthias took a few steps when the Herhardt servants began to move. The onlookers quickly backed away and opened the path for the young master to pass. Matthias walked past the platform without showing any chance of slowing down. A carriage. Matthias smirked as he found a carriage waiting for him in front of the station. Ah. Yes, master. Madame Norma doesn't believe cars are trustworthy. I know. For grandmother, cars are simply a lump of iron that is unbearably vulgar and dangerous. My apologies. Next time. No. Classic is not bad. Once in a while. Matthias calmly got on the carriage. His long arms and legs gave off movements were slow but steady. The carriage gradually picked up speed as it passed through the square and the bustling shopping streets. The separate wagon that was loaded with Matthias's baggage followed the carriage that was engraved with a golden crest off into the distance. Cry. Even better if you beg. Chapter 2. Visits by relatives who are planning to spend the summer in Arvis. Social gatherings. Insurance issues for the trade ship to sail next month. Matthias, sitting at the backside of the carriage, stared outside the window as his butler Hessen reported the family's pending issues. Matthias replied to Hessen's words with a brief answer or a nod. The directors were in charge of the company, and Matthias's mother and grandmother were in charge of the family affairs, but the power to make the ultimate decision was up to Duke Herhardt. And Matthias has been in that position ever since he was 12 years old. By the time Matthias entered the Platanus road to the Herhardt territory, Hessen's report was over. Matthias gazed at the familiar scenery with his head tilted at an angle. The tall trees that lined both sides of the driveway were arched as if they were holding hands. The fragmented sunlight gliding through the swaying leaves embroidered the path like a beautiful pattern. Passing the road and into the territory, a white mansion with a deep blue roof had revealed itself. At the front door, the mother and grandmother were out to greet the family's head. While Matthias was straightening the position of his already linear tie, the door to the wagon opened. "Welcome, Matthias." The Dowager Duchess of Arvis, Norma Katarina von Herhardt, greeted her grandson with a bright smile. Matthias bowed his head and accepted his grandmother's kiss. Leyla von Herhardt, who was standing behind them, approached Matthias with a slightly more straightforward attitude. "You've grown taller." She gave him a warm hug and smiled. Her dark black hair, just like her son's, shined in the early summer sun. Matthias replied with a corresponding smile. The greetings that were shared with the other servants who were waiting in line were not much different. Matthias's refined manner and proper courtesy were distinctly shown towards the servants. He was the perfect owner of this family, Duke Herhardt. Standing between his grandmother and mother, Matthias took the lead and crossed the lobby hall. Before he climbed up the stairs, he suddenly raised his head and looked up the huge chandelier that was lit up in the middle of the day. Beyond the chandelier was the crest of Herhardt family imprinted on the ceiling. He was a Herhardt. It was another name for intelligence, elegance, and unrelenting character. In his own life, Matthias never had any complaints or doubts. He was well aware of the type of life he had to live in and was willing to accept it. He handled his life as if he were breathing, and it was easy as that. With his gaze focused down, Matthias climbed up the stairs with large strides. When the owner of the household safely entered the mansion, the servants were now able to properly breathe. The people of Arvis prepared for days in advance to thoroughly greet Duke Herhardt. Everything and everyone had to be perfect on his arrival, including those who were residing on his land. The servants had to be on their best appearances. The Arvis uninvited guest, Leyla Lewellin, was no exception. "Did the Duke go in? Already?" Leyla, standing at the edge of the group of servants, whispered in a rather disappointed voice. The ivory dress that Bill had bought fluttered along with the girl's movement. "You'll see Duke Herhardt in the woods." "I'll have to ask for permission then." Bill Remmer gave out a blunt answer and started walking towards the woods. Leyla ran after him. "Does the Duke like the forest as well?" "Well, yeah, sure. He likes hunting." "Hunting? In the woods?" Layla's eyes grew wide open. Bill snorted as he glimpsed down the child. "Isn't it natural the forest is the hunting ground for this family?" "Then, does he hunt birds too?" "The Duke enjoys hunting birds the most." Leyla stopped walking in contemplation at Bill's insignificant remark. After realizing what he had said, Bill awkwardly gave out a dry cough. He thought of appeasing her with a proper lie, but Duke Herhardt was scheduled to be on the hunting ground in a couple of days. He was worried that he might give the child the greater shock if he tried to relieve her with his white lies. "You'll be surprised when you see the Duke's shooting skills. He's young, but he's a great marksman." Bill babbled because he thought he had to say at least something to reassure the young girl. But Leyla was already on the verge of tears. "Why does he like catching birds? There's lots of food in a mansion like that." "To the nobleman, hunting is just a form of leisure. Birds are the most interesting targets to shoot at," and Bill once again realized what he had said and turned towards Leyla. His eyes were met with Layla's upset face. "Why did you have to like birds so much?" Bill almost yelled out. He didn't know why he was bothering to explain all these things to her while having to be careful of the child's feelings. Bill ended up keeping his silence because if he said one more word, she looked like she was about to cry. A crying Leyla. He hated the sight of crying children. After hesitating, Bill started to walk again. The child followed his footsteps with her shoulders limp. The exact child who was excited to wear her new ivory-colored dress was now nowhere to be found. It had been quite a sight to see her getting so jumpy about a dress she just got. "I hope the Duke starts to hate hunting." Plus, the child, who had been silent for a long time, said cautiously, "Maybe he'll grow bored of hunting." Leyla looked up at Bill with eyes full of hope. Bill could only reply by sheepishly scratching the back of his neck. Leyla believed her prayers could have been fulfilled. A week after his return, the Duke was nowhere to be seen near the hunting ground. It was understandable because he was busy taking care of the guests who had flocked to the mansion to see him. Every day, there were clamorous gatherings held at the mansion, but the forest was silent. Summer was near its end. Baby birds hatched from the eggs, and the wild roses, which used to be in their early buds, were now in full bloom. Leyla happily observed the minor changes that were happening in the forest. "Don't go too far, Leyla." Bill raised his voice when Leyla excitedly left the cabin. "Okay. I'm just taking a walk by the river. See you later, Uncle." "Come and read on our website, Wuxia World site." "Thanks." Leyla turned around and frantically waved both her arms over her head. The old leather bag the girl was holding over her shoulder shook along with the jumpy child. Leyla was the first to see the recently hatched birds over the tree branch. The hairless baby birdlings were waiting for their mother to bring their food. Leyla scurried down from the tree and recorded the baby birds she saw today on a small note taken out from her leather bag. Although the sketches were a bit messy, she tried her best to capture the tiny birds through her drawings. Leyla drew and wrote everything she saw in the woods in her little notebook. The land was more beautiful than any other place she had ever lived in. Leyla wanted to write down everything so when the time for her to leave the place came, she could recall the memories she had in the forest through her notebook. The thought of leaving the place one day saddened her. As Leyla walked along the path leading to the riverside, she steadily recorded the forest. She stuck in pastel-colored flower petals between her notebook pages and picked some strawberry she found on the way. The sun was beginning to set when she reached the glistening riverside. Leyla climbed on top of a massive tree that stood at the border of the forest and the river. The thick lengthy branch of the tree was her favorite spot because it was as comfortable as a chair. Just when Leyla was about to open her notebook, faint clatter of horseshoes was heard from afar. Leyla hastily shoved her notebook into her bag. In the meanwhile, the galloping sound of the horse came closer. Frightened by the incoming intruder, Leyla held her breath while hugging the tree branch she was laying down on. Soon after, a horse with a smooth dark hazel fur appeared. A man was on its back. Of all places, the man chose to rest his horse right underneath the tree where Leyla was on. The man's movements from when he descended from the horse were light and flexible. Leyla believed she should come down, but the strange man was already leaning his back under the tree. Not knowing what other excuses to say, Leyla simply stared at the man raising his hand to take off his hat. It was at that exact moment when Layla's leather bag slid off her shoulders and hit the branch. The memory of the next moment was vague. The man reflectively turned his head towards the tree branch and met eyes with Leyla. Leyla gazed upon his eyes. His blue eyes, seen through the thick black hair flowing over his forehead, were like transparent glass beads. By the time Leyla pulled herself together, the man was pointing his gun towards her face. Layla's face grew pale at the thought of getting shot by the long, threatening gun. Leyla, frozen in place, simply hugged the tree for dear life. Her whole body was trembling in sweat. The man slowly gave off a silent sigh and lowered his gun. "What are you?" A low voice streamed through his crooked lips. "Leyla." Leyla managed to squeeze her voice out but was on the verge of tears. Her gold hair fluttered in the wind. "What?" His eyes narrowed further. Leyla hugged the tree so hard that her fingertips began to hurt. "Leyla. Leyla Lewellin." Uncle. Uncle Bill. Uncle." Layla's voice rang out in the woods. Bill was sitting in front of the cabin warehouse. He turned his head in bewilderment at Layla's frantic call. Leyla rushed towards him with a crimson-red face. "What's the matter?" "There's a man in the woods." He was tall. Despite her shortness of breath, Leyla was about to explain her encounter with the strange man. "You must have met the Duke who came out hunting," Bill retorted as he picked up his tools from the warehouse. His hair was black and his eyes were really blue. His voice was light as a feather. "It's Duke Herhardt without a mistake." Bill snarled with laughter. Leyla stood in front of Bill for a long time, trying to catch her breath. The beautiful but scary man stared at Leyla for some time and had turned away without saying a word. When he got back on his horse, two other men appeared from the deep forest. The man turned his horse to join the other two men as they drifted further into the woods. When they were no longer visible, Leyla climbed down from the trees and fled to the cabin. Then the Duke. When Leyla was able to say something, a cold shot rang out, shaking the calmness of the forest. Leyla was startled and she turned her head towards the direction of the sound. Surprised birds arose from the far side of the forest. One of the surprised birds fell into the trees, with its wings drooped helplessly. The shots went on a few more rounds. Bill gave Leyla a pat on her shoulder in an effort to calm the scared girl. Leyla slowly raised her head. When their eyes met, Bill unconsciously held his breath. The child was crying. Tilda, the beautiful bird slaughterer. That was the title Leyla Lewellin decided to give him. All the people of this estate, even Bill Remmer, praised him for being a perfect aristocrat. People seemed to care and love Matthias von Herhardt, who had outstanding qualities as the owner of this land. But Leyla did not agree. Ever since the day the Duke went out hunting, the mother bird disappeared. The baby birds that had recently hatched no longer than their mother to feed them. In addition, countless birds were no longer to be seen. Why did the Duke hunt only small, beautiful birds instead of large birds that are meant to be eaten? 1. Leyla, who had been observing and agonizing for over the past month, now seemed to know why. To him, the birds were moving a target. The smaller they were, the more difficult and interesting they were to aim. The Duke did not bother to look at the prey he hit. He simply turned away after hitting his target. On the days he went out hunting, Leyla buried the dead birds that were covered in blood. 2. Bang! The gunfire rang once again in the distance. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 3. The sun was scorching hot but the tree shade was cool. Leyla sat on a blanket with her arms wrapped around her knees. Bill and the other garden workers were engrossed in digging up the rose tree that had started to wilt. The garden behind the mansion seemed to have roses of all different sorts. The rose was said to be the national flower of the Berg Empire and the flower that the Duke's mother and grandmother adored. Due to another day of gunshots coming from the forest, Leyla wandered nervously around the cabin. Uncle Bill had seen her nervous state and decided to bring her out into the garden. Her mind was put to rest when the sound of gunshots faded away. Is it really okay for me to rest when Uncle Bill is working under the burning sun? Leyla uncomfortably looked at Bill. She slowly closed her eyes and let out a small sigh. Uncle Bill threatened to get angry if she helped him. He told her he hated children who don't listen. Even though Leyla's heart wasn't at ease, she decided to wait for him until he finished his job. When Leyla opened her eyes again with resignation, she was startled by an unfamiliar boy standing in front of her. The neatly dressed boy looked like he was around Leyla's age. Hey! When their eyes met, the boy greeted her with a lovely smile. He was a boy with charming platinum hair. You live here? The boy looked around and asked solemnly. Yeah. With Uncle Bill, Leyla answered as she squinted her eyes. Mr. Bill? You mean that scary gardener guy? He's not scary. Really? Seems scary to me. The boy tilted his head and casually took a seat next to Leyla. Do you live here too? Leyla asked with caution. The boy smiled and shook his head. Nah. I followed my father. He's the family doctor at the Herhardt household. He's here to give Madame Norma a medical examination. I come here with my father sometimes. Madame Norma said it was okay. 1. I see. How old are you? 12. Same. But you're kinda small. The boy staring at Leyla began to laugh. Leyla's cheeks started to flush bright red in fury. You're small too. I'm the tallest in my class though. The boy stretched out his back to prove his tall height. He certainly looked a little taller than his age. Anyways. You're still shorter than Uncle Bill. Leyla whispered softly. The boy giggled again at Leyla's words. He seemed like a happy-go-lucky child. Hey. It's impossible to find a kid or even an adult taller than Mr. Bill. I'm not so sure about that. Leyla picked at the grass growing near the blanket for no reason. Her delicate fingers slowly tainted green. She wished the boy would quickly go away but he showed no signs of getting up. Do you want some? Leyla, who then focused her attention on the peach sitting at the edge of the blanket, asked impulsively. The boy gladly nodded. Leyla took out a pocket knife from her leather bag. The boy snickered at the sight of Leyla gently cutting the peach. You're funny. Why is a knife coming out of a girl's bag? Don't make fun of me. Uncle Bill gave it to me. Leyla slightly wrinkled her nose in annoyance as she gave the half-cut peach to the boy. The sweet scent of the peach pulp tingled two children's noses. Why do you look so down? Did something happen? The boy carefully asked after he gulped down his peach. The Duke and his friends keep hunting down birds, Leyla somberly answered. The boy titled his head, wondering what the issue was. What about it? They're murdering birds for their own enjoyment. Isn't that how hunting works? Do you think so too? Leyla stared at the boy with her stern green eyes. To Leyla, the boy seemed like he would have a hard time holding the big, long hunting gun. No. The boy shook his head violently. I don't. It's cruel, the boy replied. A smile gradually began to spread on Layla's face. Do you want another peach? Leyla asked in a brighter voice. The boy nodded. Leyla cut another peach in half and handed the larger piece to the boy. The boy's cheeks started to flush as he tried to fix his uncomfortable collar. Kyle. Kyle. A faint voice was heard. The boy, who was fiddling with the dead peach seed, sprang to his feet. I have to go now. Okay. Bye. Kyle Edmund. The boy held out his hand. My name. What about you? I'm Leyla. Leyla Lewellin. Leyla awkwardly shook his hand. With their small hands covered in sticky peach nectar, the two shook hands as if they were making a truce. Bye, Leyla. See ya. I'll bring you something more delicious next time, the boy shouted as he dashed away in the distance. Leyla simply gave out a small wave because she was unsure if she could see him again if she ever stayed in this estate. When Kyle left, Layla's world was at peace again. While taking a whiff of the rose-scented breeze, Leyla patiently waited for Uncle Bill to finish his work. But at some point, she had fallen asleep and opened her eyes to Uncle Bill calling her name at sunset. Leyla rose up from her seat, carried her bag, and picked up the blanket. Uncle Bill. I saw it, kid. When Leyla was about to tell her encounter with the boy who she shared her peaches with, she was interrupted by silhouettes of people walking out from the other side of the forest. It was Duke Herhardt and his friends. Matthias paused in the center of the rose garden. The blunt gardener, Bill Remmer, was there bowing his head towards the Duke. It was not long before Matthias realized that there was a tiny child hiding behind the gardener. Long time no see, Mr. Remmer. Matthias slightly nodded. His acquaintances that were with him during his hunting session stopped behind the Duke at a moderate distance. She's going to be staying here at Arvis for the time being, Bill Remmer informed the Duke with a slightly uncomfortable look. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. When Bill tapped the girl's back to come forward, the girl hesitatingly took a step towards the Duke. Thanks to her sparkling blonde hair, Matthias was able to recall who the child was. The girl who he almost shot. The absurd little girl who almost got shot for being thought of as a bird. I've already received approval from Madame Norma and Madame Lucy, but I believe I should ask for your approval as well. Bill Remmer bowed his head once again. The child standing beside him bowed along. Matthias slowly glanced at the child. When they exchanged looks, the child frowned at him. Thin scowled eyes and clamped lips. Her expression was the exact same when they first met in the woods. You're that girl. The girl who lives in the forest. Matthias's cousin, Briette, snickered from behind. The red-faced child hid behind the gardener's back in embarrassment. The girl he occasionally met in the forest was like that as well. As soon as she stared into the Duke's eyes in wonder, she hid behind the tree. And after Matthias had finished hunting, she always came out from behind and buried the dead birds. Sure. If that's what you want, Mr. Remmer. Matthias gave a brief answer with a grin. Whatever the gardener raised in the forest was none of his business. Thank you, my lord. Bill gave him his thanks. After Matthias's chin ever so slightly nodded at Bill, he began to move. After the Duke passed the gardener and the girl by, Leyla flinched at the sight of Matthias's servants following him with their hands full of hunted animals. The deep, unpleasant scent of blood ran through the girl's nose. Layla's shoulders hunched and she closed her eyes. Uncle Bill's large, warm hands patted Layla's frail shoulders. Claudine let out an exaggerated sigh with her chin rested on the palm of her hand. Her curled brown hair bounced along to the beat of her constant sighs. Countess Brandt glanced at her daughter with her thin eyebrows. "Claudine, behave like a lady please." The Countess's inarticulate voice grew in impatience. Although Claudine was rather too young to be called a lady, she was soon to be the Duchess of Arvis. Claudine's mother let out a long sigh at her daughter's immature attitude. "But I'm so lonely and bored," Claudine grumbled. The other noble women who were drinking tea at the tea table turned their eyes at the upset brunette girl. "Then go play with your cousins." Countess Brandt huffed as her face turned crimson red. But Claudine did not bother to notice her frustrated mother. "They treat me as if I'm not here. They say things I don't understand." The ladies let out a soft smile at Claudine's annoyed expression. "Well, it can be boring. Claudine doesn't have any friends her age." Leyla von Herhardt nodded as she stroked the white dog sitting on her lap. "See? Madame Herhardt understands." A lively smile bloomed on Claudine's lip when she found someone who could understand her pain. "Who's that child?" Claudine suddenly directed her finger towards a garden after glancing at a young girl for some time. All the ladies turned their heads toward the direction Claudine was pointing at. The young girl Claudine was talking about was taking a stroll with a gardener. "Can I play with her? I think she's about the same age as me." "Well, isn't she an orphan from abroad? That kind of girl isn't suitable to be your friend." "I'm fine. I think it'll be more amusing than playing with a dog." Claudine's tone was calm and imposing. She didn't pay any attention to her mother's red ears that were about to burst in embarrassment. Leyla von Herhardt laughed and happily rang the bell. "Bring me that child." A maid arrived at the call of her master's bell. "The child the gardener is currently raising." The maid brought Leyla to an unknown world. It was a place where fancy people, dressed in candy-sweet-colored clothes, sat under the white mansion shade. "She's very cute," one of the ladies complimented. "What do you say? Do you like it, Claudine?" After examining Leyla, the black-haired woman turned over to the chestnut-haired girl sitting beside her. The girl, named Claudine, smiled happily and nodded. "Thank you, Madame Herhardt." Leyla blankly stared at the people in front of her. She wasn't sure what the ladies were conversing about. She just wanted to get back to Uncle Bill's cabin, but no one seemed to notice her desperate desire. When one of the ladies murmured an order, the maid held Layla's hand and dragged her into a room. Leyla had washed herself in a fancy bathroom for the first time and wore clothes that were surprisingly soft and white. The maid roughly combed her messy hair, but Leyla endured the pain. She believed if she said something wrong, she would risk Uncle Bill's job. "Lady Claudine is the daughter of Count Brandt. You shouldn't act recklessly in front of her. Do you understand?" The maid who dragged Leyla into the second floor of the mansion sternly warned Leyla. Leyla dazedly nodded. The maid cautiously opened the door of the drawing room. Claudine had greeted them with a posh attitude. "Hello. What's your name? Age?" Claudine lowered her head and attempted to make an eye contact with Leyla. "Leyla Lewellin. I'm 12 years old." "Really? I thought you were younger since you're so small." Although Leyla hated being called small, she decided to hold in her frustration. "For Uncle Bill." She calmed herself as she repeated those words like an incantation. "Piano. Music. Floral arranging." Claudine recommended this and that, but there was nothing Leyla could do. "Dice game. Word game. Chess." The other alternatives proposed by Claudine were the same. A vague smile came upon Claudine's mouth as she alternately looked at the table full of toys and at Leyla. "Poor you." With a disappointed sigh, Claudine slowly rose from her chair. Leyla stared helplessly at the toys assorted on the table. "You don't know a thing." Claudine walked towards Layla's chair and sighed in resignation. Her soft voice, trying not to give any hints of disappointment or annoyance, gave Leyla a greater humiliation. Leyla thought she should at least answer something, but her mouth was closed shut. In a situation like this, it was hard to say anything polite. Fortunately, Claudine turned away without waiting for what Leyla had to utter. Before closing the door, Claudine muttered aside to herself, "What the heck? No better than a dog." When Claudine left, Leyla was left all alone in the gleaming drawing room. Leyla wanted to leave right away, but she decided to wait. Maybe she'll come back, Leyla thought. But when the afternoon sun gradually ripened to a golden color, Claudine did not return. 1. The maid who brought Leyla in did not show up until evening. "You may go back." The maid's voice was softer than before. "The lady said you can keep the clothes. And this as well." The maid extended a glittering gold coin towards Leyla. When Leyla froze in place, the maid shoved the coin into her hands. "Take it. It's polite to be thankful for what your superiors give you. Do you understand? Cry. Even better if you beg." Chapter 4. Leyla left the mansion when the sky started to paint itself into a rosy color. As she left the entrance leading to the rose garden, a refreshing breeze greeted Leyla. With the gold coin grasped in her right hand, Leyla walked proudly. But her gallant steps did not last long. Claudine was sitting under the pergola that was located near the vine roses which were in full bloom. Claudine, who was having a pleasant chat with her cousins, vaguely smiled when her eyes met Layla's. "Goodbye, Leyla," Claudine greeted first. The eyes of the young man sitting next to Claudine turned to Leyla. Fortunately, Duke Herhardt was nowhere to be seen. Leyla replied with a bow. Claudine did not say much in response. Leyla began to run after she was out of their sight. She was eager to escape the strange and unfamiliar world and return to Uncle Bill's cabin. But the greatest misfortune came at the last moment. At the border between the garden and the forest path, Leyla fell down. The gold coin mockingly rolled down the paving stone and hit the edge of the man's shoe. Leyla frowned at the spinning gold coin. The man lightly stepped on the coin with the tip of his shoe to quell the clamorous sound. Leyla slowly gazed at the well-polished shoes, long legs, and then the man's face looming down upon her. It was Duke Herhardt. Surprised, Leyla reflexively rose herself up. Her white dress was stained with blood and dust from her scratched knee. The Duke simply stared at Leyla with a calm look. His red lips seemed as if they were slightly tilted to one side. Leyla clenched her lips and swept the dust off her clothes. In the meanwhile, Duke Herhardt leisurely took a step back. The coin that was underneath his foot shined, reflecting the sunlight. Although Leyla wanted to leave it, she crouched her body in front of the Duke. Just when she was about to extend her arms out, she was reminded of the words Lady Brandt left her. "No better than a dog." Those words had scarred a deep wound in Leyla's heart. Leyla grabbed the coin and politely bowed towards Duke Herhardt. She did not dare to raise her head. All she could do was to bow her head down as low as possible and hold her breath. Surprisingly, although she felt pain when she fell, she could no longer feel any pain when she bowed. Leaving the Duke behind, Leyla started running again. She wasn't able to run as fast as before because of her injured knee, but she continued to move her bloodied legs. She felt something rising from the bottom of her heart up to the end of her throat. After passing through the forest path and facing the light that came from the cabin, Leyla realized what it was. It was sadness. "I'll give this to you, Uncle." Leyla held out the gold coin in a rather solemn manner. Bill's hairy eyebrows slowly wrinkled. "What's this?" "A gold coin." "You think I don't know that?" "Lady Claudine gave it to me." "Claudine? Ah, that little noble lady." Bill nodded as if he knew the lady. Ever since Leyla was called upon the mansion, she had been looking down for the next 2 days. She didn't talk or take a walk around the woods as well as the garden. Bill realized that he missed the child's past, bright lifestyle. The world was quiet because the child was quiet. And Bill did not like that quiet world very much. "Why do you want to give me that money?" Bill leaned a little towards the table. Leyla sat in a straight posture, facing the man. "Because I think it's worth a lot." "It is worth a lot." "Even though I initially felt miserable receiving this coin, I couldn't possibly throw it away because it's worth a lot. So I realized that if I gave this coin to you instead, I can at least start paying you back after being so indebted to you." "Damn it," Bill impulsively muttered. Leyla slightly flinched but didn't pay any mind to his curse. Ever since the child arrived in Arvis, Bill worried about the aristocrats hurting her fragile heart. He expected them to harass the child because of her low status. All the aristocrats were the same to Bill: arrogant, rude, and condescending. Although Bill was afraid he might make the child cry if he asked what had happened at the mansion, He could guess how bad the child was treated there. Leyla, who had been pretending to act mature for her age, gave a childish grin when he called her name. "Since you earned the money, take it." "The money I earned?" "Yep. It's the money you earned from your work. Dealing with a bored aristocrat is a pain in the ass, but you did it. So you can confidently claim your reward." Leyla scrunched her eyebrows in confusion. While looking at the pondering child, Bill gulped down the thick glass of beer in front of him. "Really?" Leyla tilted her head as she tapped on the gold coin. "That's right." Bill swiped the alcohol that had drizzled on his beard with his sleeve. "The money I earned." Layla's face suddenly started to brighten. "Welcome to the adult world, Leyla." Bill sliced a huge chunk of meat and placed it on the child's plate. "Adult? Me? If you can make money on your own, you're considered an adult. And that's exactly what you did." "I just made one gold coin." "There are plenty of old people who still can't manage to earn a coin in this world. So you're off to a pretty successful start. Because you're off to a nice start, you're bound to be a pretty good adult." One. Bill soon started piling Layla's plate up with bread and baked vegetables. "Uncle, it's too much." Layla's eyes widened at the large amount of food. "You've been nibbling at your food like a bird for days. So eat a lot." "But you know, right? I like kids who eat like a cow." Leyla burst out laughing. "Uncle, if I eat well, I'll grow a lot, right?" "I suppose so." "Why? Did someone bully you for being too short?" "Not really, but I do think I look too young. It's upsetting." "That's because you are still a child." Bill stopped himself from stating the obvious. Leyla began to proficiently chop up her meat. For Bill, it seemed like Leyla did indeed grow quite fast in the last few months. The child no longer had a body like an iron skewer. She was quite pretty. Her natural frame was small and slender like a bird, so she didn't seem like she would grow to have a big physique. There was no doubt that she would become a beauty. Bill was surprised when he found himself praising Layla's beauty and shook his head to pull himself together. For women living in poverty, beauty was poison. They were bound to be subjected to trouble. That was why Bill was determined to send the girl to a place where he can trust. The orphanage wasn't a place he could totally trust because he believed it was the perfect place to ruin a child's life. Damned world. Damned humans. Bill emptied the rest of his beer while cursing at the names of those who left the child in his care. It was hard to know why such worries were embedded in Bill Remmer's life. He wished for days, where his life had used to be just full of flowers and trees, to come back. "Uncle, if I earn money, it's not a shame to spend it, right?" Leyla asked while thoroughly chewing on her food. "Come and read on our website, Wuxia World site." "Thanks." "Of course. Do you have something you want?" "I used up my notebook. I want to buy a new one." "By all means, go ahead." "Do you think I can buy colored pencils as well?" "Of course." "Is there anything you need?" "Why? Are you planning to buy something for me as well?" "Yes." "What if I asked you to buy me something ridiculously expensive?" Layla's expression became solemn. Whenever the girl got serious, her pupils grew darker and wider, which made her seem a bit more lovely. Bill loudly laughed as he filled up a glass of apple juice for the child. Leyla lifted the glass and motioned Bill to clink his glass towards hers. Bill gladly bumped his glass onto the glass the child reached out. Leyla then emptied her juice all at once. Bill started to worry if the child began to pick up his drinking habits. He shook his head at the thought of Leyla becoming a drunkard. "I'm only allowing this just for today," Bill persuaded himself. The long days had continued to pass, and during those long days, Bill thought about the reasons why he couldn't raise Leyla and wondered where to send a young girl. Leyla. The lovely troublesome child who suddenly appeared in his life. During those days of Bill's endless wondering, Leyla grew. The new clothes Bill had bought for Leyla got so short that her milky white calves started to show. The warehouse-like room meant for Leyla to temporarily reside in at one point transformed into a lady's room. The troublesome child who used to hop around the forest trail soon finally matured into a grown lady who now crossed the exact trail with soft steps as if gliding on water. Bill, sitting on a chair underneath the porch, looked at Leyla with a puzzled look on his face. A young lady with a willow basket full of raspberries was waving at him. "Uncle, you're back early today." Leyla lightly ran as if she was dancing. Her attractive blonde hair, tied into a single braid, shook under the white brim of the straw hat. The color of the lady's two red cheeks looked as fresh as the breed of roses Bill had recently cultivated. "You must have gone to the woods again." "Yes. It's a great harvest, isn't it?" Leyla lifted the basket with pride. "I'm going to pick some more tomorrow. I'm planning to make a lot of raspberry jam." "Are you planning to open a business or something?" "That's not a bad idea." Leyla, smiling brightly, sat on a chair placed beside Bill. Bill suddenly noticed that there were two chairs on the porch. And it wasn't just the two chairs. Before he knew it, all the furniture in the cabin was arranged for the two of them, even though Bill still hadn't made his decision on what to do with Leyla yet. 5. Leyla placed the basket on the floor and rummaged through it to find a wild peach. She held the peach out to Bill. Bill naturally took the peach, split it in half, and gave Leyla the nicely half-sliced peach. The two sat side by side and observed the forest while eating their peaches. The sound of leaves blowing across the clear sky tickled their ears, and the birds chirping from afar were as clear as Layla's voice. "It's summer again," Bill muttered unconsciously. Leyla, with a silent smile on her face, took off her hat and languidly stretched her arms. When Bill found the old leather bag that ran below Layla's knee, he burst into a loud laughter. It was the first thing he gave her on the year she arrived. "Are you planning to carry that old thing around until it's worn out?" "I like it because it's comfortable. It's still useful." Leyla held up her bag and gave it a good shake. Bill could easily figure out the identity of the rattling sound. Tin pencil case. Pocket knife. Old notes. Some beautiful feathers and flower petals. In certain aspects, she didn't change much. It was a normal evening. Bill chopped up some firewood while Leyla took out and organized the dry laundry. While she skillfully prepared their dinner, she didn't forget to feed the chicken and the goat. By the time the two faced each other from the opposite sides of the table, the sun was already down. "Kyle's coming over tomorrow. We're going to study together and have dinner. That's okay, right?" Leyla asked while setting down her delicious-smelling plate. "Why does that rascal keep coming to my house to eat when he already has a rich father already feeding him well?" "Even though you talk of him that way, I know you like the guy." "Unfortunately," Bill snorted. Leyla causally laughed as she placed the half-filled beer glass in front of him. "What's this? It's not filled to the brim." "You need to cut back on drinking for your health." "Did that glutton Edmund tell you that?" "Uncle, that good-for-nothing fellow," Bill grumbled. But he did not go against Layla's words. The night deepened at the end of a cozy dinner. Leyla took a leisurely bath after cleaning up and returned to her room. She was sleepy, but she decided to turn on the lamp and sat on her desk. An exam was just around the corner. Her summer break happiness depended on that exam result. The sound of birds crying at night was carried away by the night breeze. The noise of her pencil making marks on the paper was mixed along with the sounds. Leyla, who had been concentrating on her studies for a long time, let go of her pencil, unable to overcome the eye strain and faint headache that came over. Her eyesight, which wasn't originally that good, now seemed to have gotten worse. Ever since she was young, she had to squint her eyes to clearly see. Leyla turned off the lamp and lay down on her bed. She was almost on her goal to get a pair of glasses fitted for her. 20 bottles of raspberry jam. No, should it be 30 bottles? Anyways, it wasn't that far away. Even though her problem could have gotten resolved by telling Uncle Bill, she was afraid of burdening him. He was already providing her so many things and she wasn't able to repay him back. When he announced that he would send Leyla to school, a fine majority of people laughed at him. They told him there was no point in educating an orphan girl. They told him she was bound to become the maid of the Herhardt family when she grew. But Bill was firm with his words. He spoke to her every day. "Leyla, you're going to be a pretty good adult." The headache somewhat calmed down when Leyla closed her eyes. Leyla attempted to sleep, but the harder she tried, the more her mind turned clear. At a night like this, as usual, odd thoughts began to fill her blank mind. The birds' return. Plans for this summer. The culprit behind the series of an interesting mystery novel written in the daily newspaper. And Herhardt. When the name came to mind, Leyla gently opened her eyes. Beyond the familiar darkness, she could see the scenery out of the window. Slightly wobbling branches, the night sky shining beyond those branches, and the moon and stars staring at the blurry white light from afar. Leyla unconsciously held her breath. The Duke, who graduated from college, was commissioned as an army officer after passing the Royal Military School in accordance with the family tradition. He hadn't visited the estate for the past several years because he was assigned to the frontier overseas. It had been a peaceful time for both Leyla and the birds in the forest. But this summer, he was to return. Master of Arvis, Duke Herhardt. And that marks the end of 12-year-old Leyla. Now that the Duke is back and Leyla is now an adult, the real story will begin. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 5. Standing in front of the main gate of Gillis Women's Academy, Kyle Ettman's existence was as natural as the school's streetlights. He's here again. The female students thought as they impressively glanced over the young man waiting. Kyle looked over the gate and slyly grinned. He could see a young lady dragging her bicycle from afar. Kyle could recognize who the lady was through her graceful and gallant walk. But it wasn't just her way of walking that he could recognize the girl. Her face was always full of rich expressions and her body gestures were soft and subtle. Her entire existence was everything to him. There was no other girl like Leyla, and he had realized that ever since they met that summer underneath the shade of the willow tree. Leyla stopped when she heard someone vigorously call her name. She squinted her eyes towards the direction of the man who was approaching her. Kyle liked those moments. The moment the girl's steps grew faster after she recognized who he was. The moment the girl came up to him and smiled at him gently. "Why are you here again? It would have been more convenient for you to meet at the cabin." "Nah. I had plenty of time anyway." That was a lie. In order to return home from school with Leyla, he had ditched his tennis club members. Even though his seniors might have been waiting for him with a racket on their hands the next day, Kyle was not worried at this moment. Tomorrow's problems should be taken care of tomorrow. It'll all resolve. 1. The two students walked side by side on a busy street. They bought some ice cream as they passed by the shopping district. They then stopped by a bookstore that smelled like dust. Leyla laughed often. Besides Uncle Bill, Kyle Ettman believed he was the only one in this world who knew how often Leyla laughed in front of him and how beautiful her smile was. As they entered the path leading to the Arvis territory, the wind got cooler. Layla's eyes deepened when their conversation led to the school exam. There was a bit of despair in her eyes when geometry was mentioned. Kyle carefully observed the minor changes in her facial expressions. "Not yet." Kyle suppressed the heart-fluttering words that almost came out of his mouth. He didn't want their relationship to get uncomfortable through his hasty confession. He then wondered if it was necessary to ask her to go out with him when he was already thinking of marrying her instead. "Leyla Ettman. That sounds nice. That's good. 3. Why are you laughing?" Leyla asked him while she frowned. She was complaining about her great struggle in geometry until she found herself looking at Kyle dazedly chuckling. Well, I heard Duke Herhardt is coming back." Kyle suddenly changed the subject. "It's been a long time. When is he coming?" "I don't know. Everyone's been babbling on and on about Duke Herhardt returning, but you don't seem to really care." Layla's hands that were on the bicycle handle tensed up. During the past years, there wasn't much contact between Leyla and Duke Herhardt. They only greeted each other when they met in the woods or whenever Claudine summoned her to the mansion. Even passing by the Duke was uncomfortable that she tried to avoid him at all costs. She didn't want to see him, and she had never wanted to see him again ever since the day Duke Herhardt stopped her spinning gold coin with his foot that summer evening. Claudine was the one who invited her and left her, but the Duke was the one who made her realize how much of an insignificant being Leyla Lewellin was in that strange, colorful world. That encounter left a scar different from the mistreatment she experienced at Lovida. It was a memory she wanted to forget, but whenever she faced the Duke, he made her recall that terrible day. Leyla hated him. The Duke's appearance kept reminding her how irrelevant she was in that beautiful estate. A black car passed by as Leyla struggled to calm her uneven breathing. Madame Norma never rode a car, so Leyla figured it was Madame Alice, who must have come back from a social gathering. With the Duke back, Arvis must be hectic for a while. Yeah. Oh yeah. Leyla. Should I try becoming an officer too? Kyle now began to walk backwards while facing Leyla. I want to receive a medal just like Duke Herhardt. Captain Edmund, a brilliant marksman who can shoot down every enemy with just single shots. Kyle pretended to shoot an imaginary gun and then smiled like a naughty boy. Look here, Mr. Edmund. You can't even kill a chicken. Leyla smirked. Although his pride was hurt, Kyle failed to refute. It was at that time last year when Kyle proudly insisted that he would pay for his meals in the cabin by helping out. Uncle Bill had ordered him to catch a chicken for dinner, but when he stepped into the chicken hen, he was unable to even pull out a single feather out. That was when Edmund got his embarrassing nickname, the gluttonous herbivore. My sweet friend Kyle Edmund. That is why I like you. Leyla smiled at Kyle's upset face. I hope you use your hands to save people's lives instead of killing them. Of course. I'm planning to become a doctor. Kyle awkwardly touched his cheek. Then should I be a military doctor? Do they give medals to military doctors? If you save a lot of people, wouldn't they give you one? It's a better achievement than killing. Really? The two arrived at the crossroad amidst their conversation. Edmund's house was at the end of the road leading to the left. I left the geometry note I promised to lend you at home. Kyle wrinkled his eyes in sudden realization. Then come in time for dinner later. Make sure to bring the notes. Hey! Are you planning to wait for me or the notes? The notes, Leyla brazenly replied as she soon burst into a mischievous laughter. Kyle started to rush home. You don't have to hurry. Dinner takes time anyway. Leyla loudly shouted toward Kyle's back. Don't bother. I'm going straight to your house after picking up my notes. Kyle's retort was even louder. Plus, Leyla shook her head at Kyle's stubbornness and started to ride her bike towards the platanus road leading to the Arvis mansion. Matthias pulled the car over in the front of the mansion driveway. The driver and the butler panicked at their master's abrupt request. Duke Herhardt's return was sudden. The Arvis servants and residents were busy frantically moving around to prepare for the Duke's early arrival. As a result, his arranged social gatherings with the nobles were all moved up. Butler Hassan swallowed his dry saliva out of nervousness. Master, we still haven't. I want to take a walk. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. Matthias cut off the butler's words with his calm tone. The driver hesitantly got off his seat and opened the back seat door. No. Matthias briefly shook his head towards Hassan, who was about to follow him out. See you at the mansion. Matthias smiled as he turned his back. Hassan obediently got back in the car at his order while the driver swiftly returned to his seat. As they drove away, the road became quiet again. Holding his officer hat in one hand, Matthias began to leisurely walk underneath the tree shade. The sound of his boots and the sound of the leaves swaying in the wind created a strange, but pleasing harmony. Matthias von Herhardt was a perfect child, a perfect student, and a perfect officer. And now, he was about to marry a perfect woman and become a perfect father. All of these things were so obvious in his life that he started to get somewhat bored. Matthias gradually slowed his pace. The bright stream of light flowing through the cracks in the tree leaves made the edge of his slightly slanted eyes stand out. The light then gently flowed down upon his golden belt buckle and the shining insignia that adorned his blue-gray uniform. You should get engaged this summer. Matthias had gladly agreed to his mother's words, simply because it was his rightful duty to marry at the right time and give birth to a successor. I think Claudine is the best lady for the next Duchess of Arvis. Matthias had also accepted his grandmother's notice with good grace, simply because Claudine von Brandt was a highly qualified bride and had a brilliant lineage. Matthias had never desired anything, because everything was already in his hands before he knew it. Desire was a distant emotion that seemed fictitious to him. So was marriage. Matthias hoped for a perfect marriage. To him, marriage was simply a stepping stone that allowed him to strengthen his world. He believed there was no need to exhaust any unnecessary emotions in a marriage. Claudine von Brandt was his most reasonable partner, and for him, she was enough. He wasn't interested in anything else. He didn't feel like the need to. Matthias paused in the middle of the road. He had suddenly sensed an unexpected presence of a woman. When he raised his head, the shredded sunlight pierced his eyes. Matthias turned his eyes at a woman riding a bicycle headed towards his way. When he slowly backed away, the woman brushed past his left. Her clear golden locks fluttered in the air like waves. Leyla Lewellin? The moment Matthias remembered her name, the woman flicked her head towards his direction. The woman's green eyes widened when she met eyes with the man. While they stared at each other, Leyla had lost her balance and fell from her bicycle. Her screams were heard as the bicycle made an impact against the ground. Even after her collapse, the wheels of the bicycle still continued to wildly turn. Matthias steadily approached the woman who fell on the street. The woman raised her head underneath his shadow. Without a doubt, it was Leyla Lewellin, the little girl who was a crazy bird lover. "I'm sorry, my lord." Leyla frantically bowed her head to apologize. She waited for him to pass her by. Matthias was about to make his leave until he was distracted by Leyla's clothes. Her school uniform was dirtied with dust and blood was seeping through her torn stockings. When the spinning bicycle wheels stopped, silence came upon the two. Leyla raised her thinly frowned eyes and glanced at Matthias. Although the look on her face was insolent, it strangely made a soft impression. This girl grows as well. Although it was natural for the child to grow as time went by, her change in appearance had somehow scratched his nerves. To Matthias, Leyla Lewellin was just a little girl. The girl who always tried to desperately avoid him. The girl who he thought was insignificant. But he could no longer see the insignificant girl he knew of in his memory with the Leyla Lewellin who stood in front of him now. The slender lines of her body showing underneath the thin, summer school uniform were no longer those of a skinny child, as well as her fresh cheeks, lips, and her soft body scent carried by the wind. Leyla struggled to get up as Matthias felt a strange displeasure. Taking a step back, she fixed her shoes and dusted off her school uniform. Although Leyla was now a grown woman, her height had still failed to reach the tip of the Duke's chin. "Leyla Lewellin," Matthias impulsively called. Layla's shoulders flinched at his voice. "I'm sorry, my lord." Repeating the same words over again, Leyla crouched under his feet and began picking up her scattered items. Bag. Books. Notebook. Matthias's eyes moved along the small, pale hands that were soiled with dust and blood. His gaze fixated on a pen Leyla gently nudged while gathering her stuff. Matthias slowly took a step forward and purposely stepped on the pen. Leyla only then glanced up and saw his eyes filled with irritation. "Leyla Lewellin," he called her again. "I'm talking to you." "Yes, my lord," Leyla answered as she tightly closed her eyes. She struggled to pull the pen out of his feet, but Matthias didn't bother to budge. "I'm listening," Leyla said quite confidently, even though her body trembled. Her green eyes that had resembled the vivid summer forest sparkled in anger mixed with humiliation. She was suddenly reminded of the time when the Duke stepped on her gold coin. On that day and today as well, the Duke was looking down at Leyla with the same expression and the same gaze. After letting out a silent laugh, Matthias lifted his foot and nonchalantly passed by Leyla. He put on his officer hat and started walking leisurely along the road as if nothing had happened. Leyla blankly stared at the back of the distant Duke Herhardt. Why would he do such a thing if he is not going to say anything? 1. Layla's pen twitched in her hands. Would the people of Arvis believe that Duke Herhardt, who's praised as the perfect aristocrat, act like this? She bet her whole savings that no one would ever believe her. Everyone would have called her crazy. Leyla tightly closed her lips and pulled up her bicycle. She made sure to thoroughly wipe the pen and placed it in her bag. She then started to follow the Duke, who was walking at a slow pace. Her skin that had peeled off was terribly sore. Even though she was sure the Duke wouldn't look back, she tried to walk properly. To prevent herself from limping, she constantly flexed her leg muscles. It would have been great if he used those long legs to walk faster. When Leyla was about to sigh out of frustration, Duke Herhardt had abruptly turned around. The soft wind shook the tree leaves and the pattern of the sunlight oozing through the leaves bounced over the path in a slow rhythm. The surprised Leyla stood still. Matthias focused his eyes on her face. His gaze slowly shifted downwards along her loose, wavy hair and then onto her body, the upright chest irregularly panting up and down. The pale hand holding the bicycle handle. The unbelievably narrow ankle and petite feet. And then the eyes. Matthias examined Leyla's emerald-colored eyes for a long time in deafening silence. Leyla was still just an orphan living in the dugout located on his estate, but one crucial fact had seemed to change everything. Time passed and the child grew. And when he accepted that fact, he noticed Leyla. She was no longer a child. That woman, Leyla Lewellin. Cry. Even better if you beg. Chapter 6. There was always a nominal meeting scheduled at the Herhardt's mansion every summer. But this year, everyone knew that Claudine von Brandt did not visit Arvis just for that simple reason. The meeting was created for the two families to pre-negotiate and promote friendship between the different parties before announcing the engagement to the public. The two families' purpose of the meeting was clear and neither side had tried to hide it. Especially Claudine. "Hello, Duke Herhardt." Claudine greeted Matthias with perfect courtesy. The cousin that stood in front of Matthias had grown into a refined lady. He could barely see any traces of the short, whiny girl. "Welcome, Lady Brandt." Matthias also formally greeted Claudine back. The two gracefully smiled at each other. There was nothing new going on between the two. Although they weren't very close or intimate, they have seen each other for a long time, so they both knew how thoroughly aristocratic Matthias von Herhardt and Claudine von Brandt were to the bones. And that was the most biggest and obvious reason why they chose each other. Matthias skillfully escorted Claudine. Alice von Herhardt had ordered her servants to prepare their afternoon tea in the glass greenhouse connected to the back of the mansion. It was one way of showing Alice's consideration for Claudine because she loved the greenhouse. "This greenhouse is always beautiful every time I visit. It's as if Duchess Alice has moved heaven in here." Claudine, who drank the tea without a sound, gladly complimented. She spoke in a cheerful, yet calm manner like a courteous lady. "I've spent so much time decorating this place. I'm looking forward to passing it on to a hostess who knows its value." Alice von Herhardt replied in a soft voice. Countess Brandt glanced at her daughter with a proud and emotional look. Claudine gave a moderate, shy smile. "Matthias, show Claudine around Arvis's heaven," Alice von Herhardt whispered at the end of their tea time. Full-scale negotiations seemed to have started taking place. As Matthias extended his hand, Claudine smoothly placed her translucent lace-gloved hands over Matthias's. The sudden image of the pale white hand, stained with dust and blood, was briefly revived over Matthias's head and then disappeared. The two walked along the trail as they conversed on a moderate topic. A slow stream of water flowed down from the marble fountain that adorned the center of the greenhouse. The clear cries of birds diluted the afternoon's languid atmosphere. Claudine stealthily glanced at Matthias. Even though he always had a peaceful smile, it was hard to read his true emotions, as well as his attitude towards the world. He was a man of impeccable politeness, but he was also a man of arrogance who had never bowed down to anyone in his life. He was quite an interesting subject to observe. According to Claudine, of course. "The birds in this greenhouse are really pretty." Claudine marveled at the colorful birds perching on the branches. Matthias had only now recognized the existence of these birds in the glass greenhouse. Arvis' current hostess, Alice von Herhardt, loved birds as much as she loved roses. Just as how the gardeners were in charge of growing the roses, the zookeepers were in charge of caring for the birds in the greenhouse. Alice's role was to just enjoy the view. That was how Alice von Herhardt viewed her beautiful world. Enjoyed the work others had completed for her. "I can't believe it. This one's so obedient. What's your secret?" Claudine asked as she smiled at the small bird that had landed on her hand. Matthias leisurely looked around his surrounding. The birds in this greenhouse were surprisingly docile. Even though the window was wide open, the birds didn't dare to fly away. They continued to sing beautifully in the tranquil environment. Matthias observed the parrot waddling over its perch and the Bengalese finch singing on Claudine's hand. He then focused his attention to the gray-haired zookeeper. The zookeeper slowly walked in front of Claudine and answered, "I cut their wings, miss." Then, They can neither fly away nor escape, so they become submissive. If I let them be with their wings uncut, they become impossible for me to tame. Wings? Wouldn't that hurt them? I only cut their feathers so they won't feel a pain. It's actually a good thing for the birds because it'll prevent them from accidentally flying to dangerous places and get injured. Would you like for me to demonstrate? Would that be okay, Lord Herhardt? Claudine asked with her eyes twinkling. As you wish, my lady. When Matthias willingly gave his permission, the zookeeper escorted them to a large cage located at the end of the greenhouse. There were birds whose wings weren't clipped yet. The zookeeper pulled out a gorgeous, yellowish-colored bird among the flock of birds and approached the workbench. What type of bird is it? Matthias asked as he watched the bird. It's a canary, master. A lovely singing bird. The zookeeper briefly answered as he covered the bird's eyes with a small handkerchief and then spread its wings with his left hand. The zookeeper swiftly grabbed a pair of sharp scissors with his remaining hand. The zookeeper moved the scissors' blade without hesitation. The feathers of the cut wings scattered over the workbench. He finished up his work by snipping off the other side of the wings and let the bird free. The bird fluttered its wings desperately, but it did not fly far and slowly sank. As if the bird couldn't deny the fact that it could no longer fly, it tried to fly away several more times, but the result was the same. While watching, Matthias leaned his waist forward and picked up the panting yellow bird resting at the end of the flower bed. The little bird trapped in his grasp began to struggle and chirp, but its chirp sounded more like a scream than a song. It doesn't get tamed easily, master. It takes time for the bird to get used to the clipping. Matthias handed the bird over to the zookeeper. Would you like to try taming one, miss? Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. The zookeeper gently caressed the bird to calm it. I'm interested in watching animals, not taming them. Thank you for resolving my curiosity. Claudine politely refused and turned. Let's return to the tea table now. This time, Claudine reached out her hand first. The memory of the beautiful, sculpture-like hand that was soiled with dust and blood briefly came into Matthias's mind once again and then faded away. Before he left the area with Claudine, Matthias left an impulsive order. Take it to the bedroom. Pardon? The zookeeper's eyes widened at the unexpected remark. That bird. 1. Matthias pointed to the bird with his thinly opened eyes. My canary. Leyla neatly tied her comb blonde hair into a single ponytail. After that, she wore an apron and didn't forget to pick up her massive basket. I'm going to put an end to this. Leyla's face, as she muttered to herself, was quite serious. In addition to Duke Herhardt's arrival, Lady Brandt had visited Arvis several days ago. As a result, Leyla was in a rush. She had to gather up all the raspberries in the forest before she came across the Duke or before she got summoned by Lady Brandt. Thankfully, the two were busy. It seemed like they were getting ready for their engagement to go public. Wearing a wide-brimmed straw hat, Leyla made a quick step towards the forest. There, she found a bush of overgrown raspberries. No matter how hard the people of Arvis and the forest animals worked and ate, there were still plenty of fruits falling on the floor and rotting away. Leyla, who diligently roamed around the forest, filled up the basket before noon. Even though she felt like her arms were about to fall out because of the basket's heavy weight, she felt light-hearted. Leyla threw her basket under the tree shade. She then swiftly headed towards the river to thoroughly remove the traces of the fierce raspberry scent and color off her hands and her face. The shelter river encased the Herhardt's garden and its valleys. The river looked beautiful from the city center, but the place where the shelter river looked the best was at the Arvis cemetery. Leyla took out a handkerchief from her apron and wiped off the water droplets drizzling down her face. The refreshing river played a big role in cooling down the scorching weather during the summer. Leyla thought of dipping her feet into the river, but she then shook her head. There were 5 cousins older than Leyla in her aunt's house, where she first resided in before getting sent out. Everyone was rough and mischievous. One day, her cousins had dragged and plunged Leyla into a river. They justified themselves by stating it was her initiation ceremony into the household. If it weren't for her neighbor who saved her after hearing her yells, Leyla would have been taken by the water ghost. Even though it was her cousins in the wrong, Leyla was the one who was beaten that night by her drunk uncle. And within a few weeks, she was driven out and had moved to her next relative's house. They said they couldn't take care of a child who took their kindness for granted. Although it was unfair, Leyla decided to consider it as a good thing because she believed her next relative's house would be better to her. The next house. The house after the next. Every time she was passed on from one place to another, she hoped for a better treatment. She thought her earnest wishes came true when she finally settled down at Uncle Bill's cabin. So all was good. Leyla turned around and headed underneath the tree. She put the newspaper that was pinned in the corner of the basket into her apron pocket and began to climb the tree. Although she wasn't as quick and agile as before, she had her know-hows. She learned it from Uncle Bill. Leyla sat cozily on the tree branch like a fitted chair. She firmly believed the Shelter River was the most magnificent river in the world. Kyle, who was used to traveling to many cities, agreed to her words. Leyla thought her opinion was proved to be an objective fact. She observed the water birds looking for food as the fresh scent of the river seeped into her nose. Summer was definitely a heavenly season. Leyla, with a determined look on her face, suddenly opened the newspaper from her apron pocket and flipped to the mystery serial novel page. The detective, with his brilliant brain, was about to expose the criminal through his deductions. She began to excitedly race through the novel. It was only after a while when Matthias emerged, his face out of the water's surface. His distinct Adam's apple moved up and down to the rhythm of his heavy breathing. The man's healthy, nude body reflected over the river current. When he was about to return to his mansion, Matthias had changed his mind and began to swim towards the direction of the current. Matthias, who liked the Shelter River and the Arvis forest, moved to the boathouse next to the dock, where he could see the whole landscape in the mini-annex. His grandmother and mother rarely walked near the riverside, so the place was Matthias's private world. When there were no visitors stopping by the mansion, Matthias often visited the annex in order to blankly stare at the landscape beyond the window, read a book, or even take a nap if he was bored. It was the most comfortable place to do anything. Of course, his most favorite thing to do was when he entrusted his body into the river, just like now. While lying in the water, Matthias stared up at the sky covered in between the green branches. The wind permeated the sound of leaves swaying and the sound of rippling water along with the birds' cries. He could exceptionally feel the river's calmness today, as the mansion had been noisy over the last few days. Negotiation contracts on the marriage the Herhardt and the Brandt household were about to sign had been going along smoothly. If nothing unusual came up, his engagement with Claudine was to be announced before the end of this summer. Matthias agreed for his engagement period to last for about a year. If he gained enough honor as the Duke of Arvis, he didn't have to maintain his position as officer any longer. After spending around 1 or 2 years in the military division, he was at the most appropriate moment to discharge from the military and get married. He planned to focus all his attention on his family business after the marriage. It was a life that he would go along like the flow of the calm current. Matthias resigned his body to the river as his eyes closed. The warm sunshine, cold currents, and the sound of ripples breaking down in his ears felt as if that was everything in his world. But the moment he opened his eyes again, his perfect peace was disturbed. There was a woman sitting on the branches of the steady tree standing by the river. Before he could blink, Matthias instantly recognized the woman's identity. At that same moment, the woman who folded up her newspaper she was reading turned her head towards him. It was that annoying woman, Leyla Lewellin. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 7. For a long time, Leyla thought she was hallucinating. Leyla often did. Because of her bad eyesight, she saw the fruit that fell from the tree as a squirrel, and she often got startled thinking a tree branch floating in the water was a person. But this time, the visible silhouette was no doubt a person. And it was a man. A tall, naked man. When his wet, black hair came into view, she could no longer cling onto her self-justification that it was an illusion. Right now, that thing floating on the current was undeniably Duke Matthias von Herhardt. The bewildered Leyla dropped the newspaper in her hand. If she hadn't reflexively grasped the tree branch, she would have fallen to the ground along with her newspaper. Her conscience told her, "Close your eyes right now. No, get off the tree as fast as you can and leave this forest." Or at least scream in shock. But all Leyla could do was speechlessly stare at the man without any clothes on. It was indeed Herhardt. The man just stared back at Leyla with no intention of hiding his naked body while still floating in the water. "I hope he'll just wash away with the current." By the time the wind started to eagerly blow, the Duke suddenly began to swim towards the shore of the river, where Leyla was. "Ah, no!" Leyla's scream reverberated high into the clear sky. "No! Don't come! You can't come!" Shrieking with fear, Leyla frantically descended from the tree. She didn't bother to show her courtesy towards the Duke. She couldn't think of anything. Leyla discarded her basket as well as her hat and simply ran. She ran without realizing how swift her legs moved into the forest. Around the middle of the trail leading to the cabin, Leyla came across Kyle. The puzzled Kyle caught Leyla, who almost fell over. "Where have you been? I was on my way to find you because you weren't at home." Kyle, what should I do?" Layla's hoarsely muttered as she breathed heavily like a half-crazy person. "Why? What's going on? Did you come across a wild animal?" When Leyla vigorously shook her head, Kyle looked further beyond the road. There wasn't anything in sight. There was just an ordinary forest in front of them. "Then what is it? Why are you so surprised? What should I do?" Leyla collapsed to the ground in tears. She used her apron hem to cover her face and shook her head several times. She didn't want to remember, but the image of his well-built body kept appearing in her head. Leyla clasped her hair. "What should I do? What should I do, Kyle?" "I'll answer you if you could just tell me what the problem is." "What the hell is it?" Kyle frowned as he kneeled down in front of Leyla. It wasn't long before Layla's face turned as red as a ripe raspberry. "Hey, what the hell did you see? Did you see a ghost?" Kyle began to giggle. "No," Leyla wanted to say, but her lips did not budge. "Something scarier than that. One." The words she quietly muttered poured out through her hot gasps. The wild scene that had occurred in front of him was so unbelievable, Matthias lost his breath. Drops of water from the wet end of his hair trickled down his nose. After swimming to the dock of the annex, Matthias got dressed and returned towards the tree. It was all after Leyla had dumped all her luggage and ran off. Matthias looked through Layla's traces. A large basket and a hat underneath the tree. A newspaper on the floor. A wet handkerchief. He let out a false laugh after scanning the basket full of raspberries. Was she planning to exterminate all the raspberries growing in the Arvis forest? He was amazed to imagine that girl carrying such a huge basket with her slim arms. Come to think of it, this was the exact tree where he almost shot that little child. Matthias glanced up at the beautiful tree. He also remembered the time when the little face, sitting on the branch, vacantly stared at him. He burst into laughter. "No way. She still plays around climbing trees." He was thinking of chasing after her, but he changed his mind and headed towards the mansion. Matthias was scheduled to meet the directors of his family company this afternoon. Although he wasn't directly involved in the management of the company, it was his job to look over their plans. He also had to oversee the overall structure and the work quality of his subordinates. The Herhardt family expanded their scope to trade in resources based on their land assets. Matthias's grandfather, who acquired a huge fortune for the family, had made the bold choice to invest in the oil fields in the new empire. All the honor and authority that had been built through the previous owners of the Herhardt household were now in the hands of Matthias. Matthias was well aware of that, and he knew it was his greatest duty to maintain the honor and authority and pass them on to the next Herhardt. He was confident that he would perform his duty more perfect than anyone else. He had never doubted himself. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. Matthias headed straight to the bedroom after he arrived in the mansion. He changed his clothes and cleaned up his disheveled hair. After all that preparation, Matthias obliquely leaned against the chair positioned by the window on the west side of the bedroom. There was still an hour remaining until his next appointment. Judging that it was a waste to simply sit and wait, he was about to rise from his chair until he heard a bird's cry. Matthias headed his gaze towards the direction of the sound. The canary in the birdcage was singing on the table. He had used to believe the bird didn't know how to sing because it was so quiet, but now, the canary sang beautifully enough to overshadow his past thoughts. Matthias slowly approached and opened the birdcage door. The canary, who stopped singing, flapped its clipped wings and escaped the cage. He was thinking of leaving the bedroom but had changed his mind and observed the bird while leaning against the window frame. The tiny thing was very diligent. It flew a little, fell, and then hovered around the room without taking a break. The canary eventually got exhausted and gently sat down on the chair's armrest. Matthias picked the bird up to put it back into the cage. Instead of struggling and letting out an ear-splitting cry, the canary obediently entrusted itself to its owner. Matthias was fascinated by the change in the bird's attitude, so he tried placing the bird on his finger. He thought the bird would have run away, but it unexpectedly stayed still as it boldly stared back at him. "It feels like I've met a new world," Leyla absent-mindedly whispered in shock. The gray-haired optician laughed heartily. "It's understandable. Your eyesight was pretty bad. You must have had a hard time." "No, it wasn't all that bad. Except for when I had to read a book," Leyla cheerfully answered while putting down her glasses after she had lifted them up. The cloudy world magically became clear. Leyla was once again thrilled by the obvious. The numerous raspberries the forest provided turned into jam through Layla's fingertips. When she had enough money to match her glasses, Leyla rode her bike downtown. She easily found the optician's shop that she used to frequently pass by. After conversing with the optician for a few more minutes, she left the store. The scenery outside became too crystal clear that it was a little foreign, but amazing. Leyla expressed her gratitude and love towards the wild fruits of the Arvis forest, which shine brightly in the summer sunlight. She also thanked herself for stirring raspberry jam in front of the fire underneath the scorching sun. But why was she remembered of that terrible memory on such a happy day? Leyla suddenly frowned upon the day she unintentionally saw the Duke's naked body. How embarrassed and scared she was. Leyla hadn't dared to go back to pick up her basket and hat until the sun came down. When she finally went back, the forest was serene and the river peacefully glistened. The relieved Leyla hurriedly left the river with her basket and hat. But her cheeks had continued to burn. She was so distracted that she didn't even know how heavy the basket was in her arms. After that day, she was embarrassed to even look at Uncle Bill and Kyle. Even though it's his estate, how could he swim nude in the river? In the broad daylight? Leyla shook her head to shake off the hateful memory. "I shouldn't go to the riverside until the Duke leaves this estate." Leyla made a pledge to herself and was about to head towards the direction of the cabin until she heard a familiar voice. "Leyla?" This high, clear voice was undoubtedly Claudine von Brandt's. "Yep. That's her all right." Leyla collected her breath and slowly turned herself around. She prepared herself with a courteous smile. But when she unexpectedly met eyes with Duke Herhardt, the man who had disturbed Layla's mind just a few moments ago, she froze. Leyla could clearly see the man standing in front of her. Leyla frantically turned her eyes over to Claudine, who stood beside him. While Duke Herhardt was out working as an officer in the overseas front, Claudine didn't visit Arvis as much as she used to. It had been quite a while ever since Leyla saw the lady. Claudine had matured into a flawless woman. Leyla politely gave her respects and the two gracefully nodded to accept her greeting. "When did you start wearing glasses? I almost didn't recognize you." Leyla hoped for her to leave, but Claudine spoke again. Leyla faced her with a prepared smile. She tried hard to not meet eyes with Duke Herhardt. "Have you been well?" Claudine meticulously examined Leyla with her thinly opened eyes. "Yes, miss. We were on our way for tea." Claudine pointed to the hotel across the street with her eyes. "Yes, miss. Or I see, Mississippi." Leyla was contemplating over which response to answer when Claudine generously said, "Let's go together, Leyla." "What?" "It's been a long time since we met, so I'd like to have a cup of tea with you." "Is that all right, Duke Herhardt?" Claudine asked Matthias. Matthias expressed his consent with a slight grin at the tip of his lips. They didn't seem to care about what Leyla had to say. As usual, the two began to start their walk as Leyla followed from behind. The servants who accompanied them quietly followed suit. Leyla sighed and dragged her bicycle. The creaking sound of the old wheel mingled to the sound of the footsteps. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 8. The doorman looked flustered. Leyla nodded towards him as if she understood. She was sure one's ever brought a junk bicycle to the best hotel in the city. After the doorman took several turns of examining Leyla and Claudine, he took away her bicycle. Leyla expressed her gratitude with a short greeting and entered the hotel. The tea room was sitting on the right side of the central lobby. Coming with his quick steps, the manager guided them to the terrace that was headed to the riverside. Leyla was the last to sit at the table. Her seat had happened to be facing right across Herhardt. Leyla hurriedly focused her eyes on her legs in order to avoid his vacant stare. The thin, gold-rimmed glasses glistened in the summer sun. Shouldn't the person who was seen naked be more embarrassed than the person who saw it? Leyla was amazed at the Duke, who continued to casually look at Leyla as if nothing had ever happened at the river. It was understandable. To the aristocrats, commoners and servants were nothing more than furniture or painting. No one was ashamed of being naked in front of a furniture. And there wasn't a furniture that was ashamed to see a naked person. When Leyla reached her conclusion, the table was set up. Even though Herhardt didn't order anything, there was a cup of strong scented coffee placed in front of him. His fingers holding the teacup were very smooth and long. Claudine and Matthias continued their own conversation as if they had completely forgotten about Leyla's presence. The exhibition they saw today. An update on their relatives. A weekend party at the mansion. Matthias's soft, low tone and Claudine's fluttering, high tone crossed at regular intervals. Leyla wondered why they decided to bring her along if they were going to converse among themselves. Lady Brandt's actions were largely beyond Leyla's understanding. She never understood her ever since the first summer they met. So, Leyla. How's school? Are you having fun? Claudine's voice was suddenly heard along with the sound of the cup being laid down on the saucer. Although she was only a year older than Leyla, she always spoke as if she was talking to a child in an adult-like way. Yes, miss. For Uncle Bill. Leyla incanted in her head while she answered Claudine. With a satisfied nod, Claudine formally asked a few more questions about Leyla's school life, and Leyla repeatedly answered with a consistent smile. Yes, miss, was what Claudine had only expected from Leyla's responses. And Leyla was accustomed to answering that way. You'll be graduating next year, right? Although she had a dull look, Claudine's tone was rather amiable. Yes, miss. Leyla continued to answer faithfully. What are you planning to do after graduation? I'm taking a class preparing for a teacher's certification. A teacher? Claudine stretched the corners of lips as she grasped the teacup. The ribbon and the corsage that decorated her small hat shook along with her nods. Good girl, Leyla. That's a great goal. I think it would suit you very well. Claudine smiled again, praising the commendable child. Isn't that right, Herhardt? Leyla inadvertently turned her eyes towards Matthias. With her glasses on, his eyes gave off a more lucid blue color. When Leyla realized that she had been staring at the Duke for too long, she hurriedly dropped her gaze. I see. He casually expressed his agreement. After that, Leyla's presence faded away again. Leyla was relieved. She simply wanted this uncomfortable tea time to quickly end. She was supposed to meet Kyle in town, who had gone out to play tennis. She was worried was late for her promise. The anxious Leyla raised her head. At the same time, Matthias turned his eyes and met hers. Instead of avoiding eye contact like before, Leyla looked back at him in silence. When she was young, she thought his blue-colored eyes would make a clear, tingling sound. They resembled her of a round, sapphire-colored glass candy. Leyla shook her head at her young self's absurd thoughts. Well, pardon me, Herhardt and Lady Claudine. Leyla could no longer stand waiting in silence and opened her sweet lips. May I be excused? After she moved her gaze from Matthias's eyes to Claudine's face, she felt like she could breathe again. I have made a promise to meet my friend later today, Leyla nervously but impatiently said. Claudine smiled and gave her permission with a nod. Leyla relieved her tensed-up face. After she gave her polite farewell, Leyla hurried out of the hotel and pedaled her bicycle frantically across the busy streets. However, the further she pedaled away from the man, the more vivid his face appeared in her head. It's because of the glasses, Leyla thought with a heavy breath. She believed her glasses was the main reason why she was bewitched by the Duke. It was natural to have her breath taken away at the sight of the Duke with her improved eyesight. When she was about to feel faint and dizzy from all that pedaling, Leyla arrived at her appointment. Kyle was there first. He broadly smiled and waved towards Leyla. She had entered her safe world. She's grown up quite a bit, hasn't she? She seems like a lady now. Claudine looked towards the direction Leyla had left. She sounded like Leyla was her daughter even though she was only a year older. Because she is a lady. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. Matthias gave a moderate, impassive answer with his proper smile. Yes. Because she is one. Claudine, lost in thought for a moment, then smiled as brightly as the summer sun. Oh. Did you hear? Riette had recently bought a nice new car. Claudine skillfully changed the subject. The two resumed their conversation in the world they shared. It was as if Leyla Lewellin, who used to sit on the opposite side of their table, had never been there in the first place. But Leyla had revealed herself in front of Matthias again at an unexpected place. After having a relaxing tea time, Matthias was on his way back to his mansion. The road was congested so his car was stopped. Matthias casually glanced out of the car window. Leyla was there. While dragging her bicycle, she was walking along the street with a boy. It seemed like the friend she had promised to meet. Matthias then remembered the name of the boy with a familiar face. The doctor's son. Kyle Edman. Leyla Lewellin shouted at the boy who kept tapping on her glasses, but the boy's mischief became more naughty. Leyla sighed in frustration and then laughed. After a long time of laughing and joking around, the two stopped in front of the library stairs. Leyla parked her bicycle and sat at the end of the stairs. The boy followed her with a paper bag. 2 bottles of soda and a sandwich came out of the bag. Leyla Lewellin and the boy sat side by side and shared their food. Every time the boy said something, Leyla laughed. And when Leyla laughed, the boy laughed along with her. In the meanwhile, the congested road started to clear out. When the car started running again, Matthias moved his gaze away and turned towards Claudine, who was sitting on the opposite side of the car window. The two smiled at each other and once again, their proper conversation began. At that moment, Matthias unconsciously recalled his memory during their tea time. Leyla Lewellin never touched the teacup in front of her. She sat still in an upright position with her hands on her knees and then left quietly. She left me for the boy. The painful truth evoked his recollection of Leyla's nervous and agonized expression. She wanted to go to the boy. When his thoughts reached that point, his memory of Leyla's back, which was leaving the hotel terrace, was revived. She had hurried as if she was running away. She left me to go to the boy. The car carrying the two had already entered the Platanus road leading to the Arvis estate. When Claudine and Matthias passed by the very road where Leyla had fallen from her bicycle, Matthias admitted. Leyla Lewellin couldn't dare to be anything to him. Yet, he was not very happy about this emotion he was experiencing. Since I ate your sandwich, I'll buy you ice cream. Leyla stood up from the library stairs with a light smile. She carefully packed the empty paper bag along with the bottled drinks and placed them into her bicycle basket. No thanks. You don't have to owe me. Kyle got on Leyla's bike with a slightly awkward smile. Leyla naturally sat on the back seat of the bike. He could clearly feel Leyla's body temperature being transmitted to his back even in the midday heat. Kyle started pedaling, trying to cool off the warmth from his cheeks. She can hold on to me a little tighter. Leyla held his shirt so gently that it seemed like she was tantalizing him. But he was still satisfied with her grip. He had purposely left his bike behind in order to ride Leyla's bike with her. Of course, Leyla was oblivious of his intentions. You know what, Kyle? Layla's soft voice permeated through the rushing wind. Yeah? I'll still buy you ice cream. He was wondering about what she had to say, so he laughed at her sudden offer. Tell me honestly. You just want to eat ice cream, don't you? It's not like that. It was like that. Kyle pulled up his bike in front of the ice cream shop while Leyla ran inside. He was about to follow her inside, but he changed his mind and leaned against the store wall to cool off underneath the shade. Leyla soon came out with 2 vanilla ice cream cones in both her hands. The two ate ice cream alongside each other. Although this was one of their daily routines, Kyle kept gazing at Leyla. Her new glasses seemed unfamiliar to him. Leyla. Kyle softly whispered her name. When Leyla turned her head, her cheeks were red. Although her cheeks were red because of the hot weather, Kyle's heart palpitated loudly. After nervously swallowing his saliva, he gulped down his ice cream in one big bite. Too. It's delicious. The ice cream. Leyla smiled after waiting for Kyle's words. I know, right? Vanilla's my favorite flavor. Leyla looked up at the clear summer sky. Kyle stared at Layla's long, thin neck as he started to eat his ice cream again. It was cold and sweet. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 9. Is she the one? The orphan the gardener is raising? Wrinkles formed on Countess Brandt's forehead as she gazed at the garden over the window. A lady in glasses was helping the gardener organize the rose garden. Yes, mother. Leyla, it's her, Claudine bluntly answered. While Countess Brandt was distracted by Leyla, Claudine calmly moved her needle through the cloth. Colorful roses bloomed from her fingertips as she diligently finished up her embroidery. She's a very pretty girl. I think she's getting prettier as she matures. Doesn't that bother you? I know what you're worried about, mother. Claudine put down her embroidered cloth. Countess Brandt's eyes were wide open with a worried look on her face. The weak Countess Brandt had one daughter after a series of miscarriages. That child was Claudine, the Brandt household's only daughter. The Countess, who was suffering from an inferiority complex of being unable to provide her husband a successor, lived in fear of her husband falling out of love. Although the Count's mistress was also unable to provide him a son, Countess Brandt was still worried. Worried that one day, some young, beautiful woman will show up and birth him a son and take away everything. Claudine felt sorry for her mother. But she was tired of her mother's excessive concerns. I don't want to dwell on those type of things. Claudine's words were solemn as if she was making a declaration. The Countess helplessly sighed. You're too young to know men. Claudine, if I were you, you would get rid of all the beautiful women in the world out of Duke Erhardt's sight? Claudine let out an exaggerated sigh. As you said, I am still young and I don't know men that well. But I do know that men of great reputation usually have 1 or 2 mistresses alongside them. Oh, my God. Claudine. Of course, I hope such a thing doesn't happen, but even if it does happen, I know it's not a big deal. Claudine lightly shrugged. When she had recently come across Leyla by chance, the usually calm Claudine was surprised. Although it was natural for a sweet girl to grow into a beautiful woman, Layla's mature appearance was more beautiful than expected. With her unique, small body and delicate facial features, she looked like a fairy. The combination of her mysterious green eyes and her transparent white skin enhanced her resemblance to one. That was the reason why Claudine had asked Leyla to accompany her for tea. She was curious. Curious to know how the Duke would react to such a woman. And he had exactly acted up to Claudine's expectations. With proper interest and indifference, with perfect decency and moderation. That was enough for Claudine. But Claudine, there's nothing good about keeping that child close to Matthias. Countess Brandt still looked restless. Why don't I have a talk with the Herhardt household? Mother. Claudine's voice sank low. Claudine was determined that she wouldn't live like her mother, who cried because of love despite the fact that she had everything. That was why Claudine agreed to be engaged to Matthias. Matthias von Herhardt was noble, rich, and handsome. Claudine believed that kind of man would never only love his wife that he married in an arranged marriage. She knew her life wasn't the happy ending of a fairy tale. Maybe he too might be swept away by his desire for a beautiful woman. Like father. Like so many other men. But men who regarded their mistress simply as a mistress were harmless. It was men who didn't regard their mistress simply as a mistress that caused trouble. Claudine was sure Matthias was the former type of man. Do I love him? Claudine tilted her head and just smiled. Maybe. Maybe not. But it wasn't a big deal. Matthias knew that as well. What mattered to her the most was whether the Duke of Arvis was capable of playing the role of a great husband and the role of a perfect father. Claudine simply wanted that. A marriage that could protect her dignity and elegance. What's the big deal if Duke Herhardt's interested in that humble, beautiful child? The words that were calmly brought out by Claudine astonished Countess Brandt. My God, Claudine. What the hell are you talking about? She'll simply just become a mistress at least. Claudine laughed. It actually might be convenient for me for a girl like that to become a mistress. A woman who can't dare to threaten my place, who I can tame with the grasp of my palms. Claudine, my child. You really don't know anything about love. Countess Brandt's lament for her daughter deepened. She looked into her mother's shiny blue eyes and then turned her head away with a strange smile. She looked at Leyla out the window. The woman stood up from the flower bed and was laughing while massaging her back. The cabin was empty when Kyle arrived. Leyla and Uncle Bill had seemed to have gone to the garden together. Kyle sat on the porch chair, waiting for the two to come back. When he thought of Layla's face with glasses on, Kyle grinned. The future Mrs. Edmund was attractive even in glasses. Although he initially felt a little strange looking at her new appearance, his heart now fluttered at the thought of her face. Kyle purposely coughed in order to prevent himself from having his cheeks turn red. Around that time, Leyla and Uncle Bill had returned. What the hell is that hat? Kyle's brow frowned when saw a rustic hat covering Layla's lovely face. Wow. So tacky. You didn't pay for that, did you? When Kyle mischievously teased her, Layla's and Bill's eyes both turned towards him. Their glares were quite fierce. Uncle bought it for me, Leyla shouted as she scowled at Kyle. Bill retorted by picking up the shovel he had loaded on the cart. On second thought. Wow, it's pretty. Uncle Bill has a good eye. Kyle hurriedly changed his view. Don't make fun of it. It's really precious to me. Leyla took off the problematic hat with a look of disapproval. It was a rather glitzy straw hat, lavishly dressed with artificial flowers and ribbons. Leyla prepared lunch while Bill was busy putting away his cart. The problematic hat was placed at the end of the table. Kyle sat in front of the hat and tried to read Layla's expression. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. Leyla, are you mad? Yeah. Leyla slammed Kyle's plate down as hard as she could. At least she's still feeding me. Kyle was relieved. I'm sorry. You know I wouldn't have said that if I knew. Whatever. But why did Uncle Bill decide to gift you a hat? Because I asked him to. You know how to ask for stuff? Kyle asked in surprise. The Leyla he knew was a child who rarely asked anyone for anything. My glasses upset him a lot. Layla's voice dropped. Was he upset that your eyesight got worse? No. That's not it. He was upset I never told him that I was planning on buying expensive glasses with my own savings. Leyla sat across Kyle after she was finished setting the table. Uncle Bill was dazed. It was as if he had been hit on the back of his head when Leyla showed up in the cabin with glasses on. After hearing her explanation of how she came to get her glasses fitted, his expression was as cold as an ice sheet. It was the first time Uncle Bill been so angry towards her. Leyla. Am I not that reliable to you? Bill sighed. Leyla felt suffocated looking at Bill's sad eyes. The more she clarified, saying that she didn't want to burden him and was thankful for everything that he had done for her, the more his eyes saddened. Ever since that day, their relationship had gotten rather awkward. Bill was sulky and refused to speak while Leyla was at a loss of what to do. The answer she found was the hat. Uncle, please buy me a hat. Leyla blurted at the dinner table a few days ago. I'd like a very pretty hat, please. Uncle Bill laughed at her serious tone. The next evening, the old man who had gone downtown to buy a pair of electronic scissors came back with a straw hat decorated with flowers and ribbons. I bought it at Lindsay's. So if you don't like it, go ahead and return it. Bill carelessly added while holding out the hat. Did you pick it yourself? Well, yeah. It's so pretty. Leyla brightly smiled and wore the hat. Uncle Bill had personally bought her many things, but in most cases, he had asked Mrs. Mona to buy stuff for Leyla or he directly took Leyla out to the store to pick out what she needed. Leyla knew too well how difficult it must have been for Uncle Bill to choose a female hat. She also was aware of how big his love was for her. For Bill Remmer, flowers were the prettiest thing in the world. So he believed a hat with many flowers was the prettiest hat. He was sure he picked the most charming hat. Hey! You should have told me that before. There was an embarrassment in Kyle's face as he attentively listened. Now I feel like a scumbag for making fun of that gift. When did you give me a chance to talk? You teased me as soon as you saw it. That's true, but you cheeky gluttonous herbivore. You're eating up all my food again. Someday I'm going to ask Dr. Edmund to pay for all that food you ate here. Bill, who burst into the door, loudly yelled. But his face was friendly and his tone was playful, which was completely different from his harsh words. Bill then chuckled awkwardly at the sight of Layla's hat on the table. Layla's expression, smiling at Bill, was so sweet that Kyle was almost pathetically jealous. The man who loved Leyla Lewellin had no choice but to accept the fate of being second place in Layla's heart. Layla's number one was forever Uncle Bill. Comforting himself, Kyle grabbed the fork. He didn't mind Uncle Bill's nagging. Layla's food was delicious enough to bear Bill's harsh lectures. When Uncle Bill went back to work after lunch, only Kyle and Layla were left in the cabin. Layla sat on the porch, reading as usual. Kyle stared at Layla as he pretended to read. Except for the time when she had to put down her book to eat some biscuits, Layla was totally fixated on her book. I shouldn't have lent you that novel. Despite his bitter regret, Kyle smiled. Layla wouldn't know how charming her face was when she was concentrating on her book. How lovely she was when she munched on her biscuits with those luscious lips. Should I tell her today? Kyle, who had put the book down on the floor, looked at Layla with a stern expression. He believed he could wait a little longer, but now, he wasn't so confident. Even the touch of Layla's fingertips made his heart feel like it would burst. His body heated up as he often had guilty dreams of her. Kyle was recently worried about his concern. He feared that one day, someone would appear to take Layla away from him. So wouldn't it be better to make a reckless confession? The sound of slow horseshoes was heard from a distance when Kyle was about to open his warm lips. When Kyle turned his head to the direction of the sound, he saw Duke Herhardt in his equestrian uniform. Layla, who was just about to take another bite of her biscuit, was surprised by the visitor. The Duke stopped his horse in front of the porch railing. His glance, which briefly brushed past Kyle, paused on Layla's face. Her face was blushing in confusion. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 10. What about Mr. Remmer? The Duke asked Layla. Uncle went downtown for the moment. Is something the matter? Layla managed to answer after wiping the biscuit crumbs off her lips. With a short nod, Duke Herhardt turned his gaze towards Kyle. When he met eyes with Kyle, his lips curled into an affable smile. Only then did Kyle relieve his instinctive vigilance. After asking to convey his gratitude in regard to Kyle's father for taking good care of Norma's health, he then looked back at Layla again. Miss Lewellin can bring the roses in on behalf of Mr. Bill, right? He slowly spoke as the smile on his lips disappeared. Roses? You mean the roses in the garden? Moderately cut off some roses and bring them to the annex. With a slight nod, the Duke laughed. He hadn't even listened to Layla's answer. Layla sighed hopelessly after looking at her blouse and skirt, which was covered with biscuit powder. Although she shook off the powder, it wasn't enough to shake off the humiliation. Stop it. There isn't any powder on your clothes anymore. Kyle burst into laughter as he then watched Layla repeatedly rub her lips. Why did he have to show up like this? Why not? Do you think the Duke's never eaten a snack in his life? But Layla unwittingly rubbed her mouth again. Why do you care when you always eat messy in front of me? You're my friend. And Duke Herhardt is a stranger. You don't have to care about him more than your friend. That's true, but I don't know. It's so uncomfortable. Layla wrinkled her nose. Why? Did something happen? No, it's not that, but it's so uncomfortable and suffocating with the Duke around. Anyways, I don't like it. What about me? I'm comfortable and nice, right? Kyle asked with a subtle expectation. Layla smiled and put on her hat. Of course, Mr. Edmund. Kyle's grin lit up at the satisfactory answer. As expected. I knew it. Ah, should I help you with your errand? No, It's not a big deal. You should go home now. Then I'll wait here. I'm fine. Mrs. Etman will be eerie upset if she finds out you were hanging out here again. Don't get me scolded along with you and go study. Kyle's eyebrows flinched at Layla's reasonable point. He wanted to refute but couldn't. Kyle looked carefully towards the direction the Duke had disappeared to. I'm probably being too oversensitive these days. It was just Duke Herhardt, the flawless aristocrat who was about to announce his engagement to the public. But then, Layla. Kyle tried to stop her. The thought of Duke Herhardt and Layla being together still somewhat made him anxious. Meanwhile, Layla was about to leave the porch as she said her farewell while holding a pair of scissors and a basket in her hands. See you tomorrow, Kyle. Don't go. Kyle simply waved his hands in effort to swallow down the words that he had wanted to say. It's Duke Herhardt. What could go wrong? While Kyle was repeating those words like a spell, Layla had moved towards the other side of the path. Tilda. Again. Matthias's voice touched Layla's back. Only after a few moments of blinking did Layla realize that his words were directed at her. Layla turned to him while holding her breath. Matthias sat, facing the butler at a table placed by the window. He was examining the documents that were piled up on the table. With colors that aren't flashy, Matthias slowly said with his eyes focused only on the documents that he held in his hands. Again. Soon, there was a ridiculously gentle smile on Matthias's face when he looked at Layla. Layla clenched her fists tight in order to bear the pent-up irritation. So the roses were the problem. The roses that he told her to moderately cut down. While Layla glared at the roses, Matthias's gaze turned emotionless. The butler hastened and continued his report, and Matthias, who was listening, replied back with brief instructions. The presence of the insatiable errand girl was completely erased in the room. For Uncle Bill, reiterating the incantations, Layla quietly left the annex located by the river and headed back to the garden. That guy, who bullies a person at 2 p.m. in the middle of summer, is supposed to be a gentleman. She emphatically expressed her dissatisfaction at his unacceptable reputation. Even though she was disinterested in the mansion affairs, Layla was aware the detached annex along with the river was Duke Herhardt's. He rarely had guests in that annex and the number of servants who came in and out was limited. Layla initially thought the reason why he wanted the flower in the annex was because of Claudine. Claudine was about to get engaged to him, so there was a chance that Claudine might have started using the annex as well. So Layla, who knew Claudine's preference of bright flowers, had cut down the most gaudiest colored roses and presented them to the Duke. Only to get rejected by him, of course. When Layla got out of the forest, the shadowless garden appeared in sight. Layla boldly walked and cut the roses again with great care. In response to the Duke's stressful demands, she chose subtle colored roses this time. Most of them were the types of roses that Layla liked. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. While holding a basket full of flowers, Layla headed towards the annex again under the stifling summer afternoon sun. Why didn't you just tell me the color you wanted in the first place? Layla vented her anger by kicking the stones on the floor instead of spitting out the words that she had in mind for the Duke. I hate you. The words that Layla could never directly say to him were left behind along with the stone she purposely kicked. By the time she was about to feel dizzy from the sweltering heat, Layla arrived in front of the detached house. The beautiful annex located next to the dock was built as if it was half floating on the river. On the first floor, there was a boat hangar and a kitchen filled with simple refreshments, and on the second floor, there was a reception room, a bedroom, and a dining room intended for the Duke to rest and eat in. Layla climbed the outer stairs leading straight to the second floor while holding the basket of roses in her hands. The butler and a middle-aged maid were about to leave the annex. After greeting them her farewell, Layla turned to the reception room. Matthias was still sitting on his chair, with his eyes closed and head tilted back. Should I wait? While Layla was contemplating, he thankfully opened his eyes. His softly tangled hair was covering his forehead. I've brought you new roses, Your Grace. Layla slightly lifted the basket full of flowers. The Duke simply stared at the cup of whiskey placed in front of him and didn't bother to open his mouth. He had taken off his horseback riding jacket and loosened up a few buttons on his shirt. Because of his get-up, he looked much more defenseless and languid than before. "Should I go back again?" Leyla's voice quivered as she carefully asked. If she had to go to the garden once again, she felt like she could have hit the Duke with the roses. "If I tell you to go, are you going to?" he asked with a slight drowsiness in his voice. "If I made another mistake, I'd go, but please tell me the color of the roses you prefer this time." "Yes, Your Grace." That was the answer she had originally planned to say, but her mouth said the other. Matthias, who was leaning deep into the chair's back, fixed his posture and sat upright. "Sit down." Matthias pointed to the seat that was placed at the opposite side of the table with his eyes. "No, if my lord is satisfied, I'd now." "If you brought the flowers, wouldn't it be your job to arrange them in a vase, Miss Lewellin?" "But Your Grace, I'm not very good at arranging flowers." "Then, do you expect me to do it?" Matthias looked around the room and then turned his eyes back to Leyla. Leyla didn't find it difficult to recognize what that brief gesture meant. He and Leyla were the only ones in this detached house. She had no choice but to do something she wasn't confident in. She took a cautious step forward. The opposite seat was too burdensome for her, so she carefully sat on the wooden chair in front of the window that was facing the river. As Leyla began to trim the roses, Matthias turned to his piles of documents scattered across the table. The sound of the scissor blade cutting the fresh flower stalk and the fluttering of the document paper permeated into silence. At the moment he finished signing the last review document, Matthias suddenly recalled the bird living in his mansion bedroom. Putting the zookeeper's words that canaries were difficult types of birds to tame in vain, the canary in Matthias's bedroom followed him well. It sat on his finger and sang without any hesitation. He looked at it for a long time, amazed at the fact that the unbelievably small bird could sing so beautifully. The flapping bird that had sat on his finger even cried a little, as if it was chatting about its day. While he was organizing the documents, Leyla quietly went to the bathroom and filled the vase up with water. Her steps were light and swift. It was soon proved that Leyla's words were no lies. Her flower arrangement was a mess. "Do you like it?" Leyla hesitantly asked as she brought up the rose-filled vase up to Matthias. "It's terrible." Matthias's tone wasn't condescending, but dry. Leyla's eyes blinked in shock as her cheeks turned red with embarrassment. "I'm sorry. I'll bring in a qualified maid." "Sit." "Pardon?" "Sit, Leyla." When his voice dropped, the tension in the atmosphere increased. His fingers pointed exactly towards the sofa located at the opposite of his seat. Leyla placed the criticized rose vase on a console table near her and stiffly sat where Matthias had pointed to. "Eat." Matthias turned his gaze towards the silver-colored dome dish that was placed near the sofa. Leyla awkwardly opened the cover. There were sandwiches and a glass of lemonade meant for one person. Matthias stared at the perplexed Leyla. He thought if she liked those types of food, he was going to give Leyla the right amount of expenses for her work. The results of her work were lousy, but she had made quite the effort. "Thank you, Your Grace. But I'm fine." Leyla laid down the dome dish with trembling hands. Her face, that used to brightly smile in front of the doctor's son, simply looked perplexed now. "If you don't want me to do anything else, I'll take my leave." "Leyla." Matthias's voice was now close to a whisper. Leyla slowly blinked while Matthias took a sip of the cold whiskey in front of him. The droplets on the surface of the crystal glass slowly rode down his long fingers. "Do my words sound like a request to you?" Matthias smiled as his lips reddened with the wet whiskey. "Cry, even better if you beg." Chapter 11. Deepwater, 1. The annex, which had large windows attached in all directions, provided a panoramic view of the forest and the river. It was also a place where the wind could freely flow in and out. The weather today was hotter than ever, so it was hard to feel any chills. But Leyla felt shivers go down her spine. She was determined to quickly eat and leave, but the food in front of her didn't seem to reduce in amount. Leyla didn't think she could swallow anything. She already had lunch and even ate a snack. And to count it off, she ran an errand under the sultry heat, so she had lost her appetite. Matthias concentrated on his work with his head tilted, But Leyla still found it hard to breathe properly. Is this like a punishment for my poor errand and flower arrangement? Leyla pondered as she swallowed another bite of the sandwich. If so, Duke Herhardt had accomplished his goal. Leyla felt like she was being punished. Leyla hurriedly drank the lemonade to beat the urge to spit out her sandwich. After she wiped the water droplets off her hands with her apron, she picked up the sandwich again. Leyla then lowered the hem of her hat to cover her face that filled with dread. It was at that moment when a long finger suddenly touched the tip of her chin. If you're a lady, Leyla. His hand untied the ribbon knot that was tied under her chin. You're supposed to take off this hat when you're inside. Before Leyla could even reply, Matthias took off her straw hat. Surprised, Leyla reflexively leapt from the sofa. The sandwich fell because of her sudden movement and rolled over the floor. The corner of Matthias's eyes slanted, but Leyla's attention was only focused on her hat. Give it back. Leyla's voice was now quivering with anger, not fear. Give it back, please. I will take my leave now. I want to go home. Give it back. Matthias tightly clutched the hat he snitched. He had no intention of returning it. Leyla reacted as if she was stripped naked, even though it was just her hat that had been taken away. Leyla's red blush that had traveled down her neck amused Matthias. Her sensitive skin had easily responded to her irritation. Eat. Matthias pointed to the sandwich that still had 2 slices left. Eat, get your hat, and go back. It's easy. No, I don't want to. Leyla shook her head as she approached him. I don't want to eat. I can't anymore. I hate it. Leyla's frightened eyes were shaking. She seemed like she had no idea what she was talking about. Matthias rose from his chair as his grip on the hat tightened more. His figure had cast a shadow over her. You hate it? It's all my fault, so please give it back. Leyla stretched out her hand. She looked as if she was about to burst into tears. Matthias looked at her face and slowly lifted her hat over his head. Leyla's eyes moved along with his movement. When their eyes met, Matthias threw the hat lightly over the window. The wind carried away the hat, and it gently flew over the river. Leyla gave him an icy glare and frantically ran out of the reception room. Matthias approached the front window that overlooked the dock and the river. Leyla, who soon appeared on the dock, started stamping her feet around in panic after looking at the hat that was floating on the water. She suddenly took off her apron and glasses and set them on the dock. Are you going to jump into that river just to get that stupid hat? Standing in front of the window, Matthias gave her a rather amused stare. Leyla was shaking. It seemed like she was afraid of the water. Are you serious? Matthias sneered as Leyla entered the river. She hesitated in the river for a moment, but then started to walk towards her hat. Leyla Lewellin didn't stop when the water level reached her knees, her waist, and then her chest. Matthias watched with his arms loosely folded. Leyla reached out her hand to the fullest, but the river current had pushed her hat as it traveled farther away. When Matthias thought she was going to give up, Leyla suddenly took a bigger step closer to her hat. The water level should be deeper than your height by now. Layla's hand finally grasped the ribbon end of the hat while Matthias slowly tilted his head. At that same time, Leyla Lewellin's figure disappeared below the surface. As expected, Matthias softly murmured and frowned. Leyla drowned exactly at the point he had predicted her to submerge in. Surprised by the sudden deep in water, Leyla struggled desperately. But the more she struggled, the deeper she was pulled into the river. She was grabbing onto her hat for dear life. With his arms now unfolded, Matthias headed for the dock with wide steps. His other prediction was proved right. Leyla Lewellin had jumped into the river even though she didn't know how to swim. Stopping at the end of the dock, Matthias looked upon the floundering Leyla. Her screams gradually faded away as she repeatedly rose to the surface and sang, "Eat, get the hat, and go back." What a fuss she created when she could have done that simple task. Sighing between his twisted lips, Matthias dived into the river. The wooden panels on the dock that touched Layla's cheek were hot from the sun. When she felt the vividness of the heat, Leyla realized that she had safely come out of the river. Pain and fear soon followed the relief. Leyla trembled as a deluge of coughs came out of her mouth. Even at that moment, She had refused to let go of the hat she held onto. Leyla's appearance was so absurd that Matthias lost his breath. She heard a mixture of weak breaths and a low laughter coming from the Duke. Leyla Lewellin met eyes with him by the time the droplets of water from her wet body left a dark stain on the wooden floor. "How can you do something like this?" Leyla asked while gasping for breath. She gave him a dirty look, but it was the tears in her eyes that caught his attention. Sweeping his wet hair that covered his forehead, Matthias looked at her as if she was something entertaining. As Leyla's breathing calmed down, his laughter grew louder. Leyla lifted her upper body up with her trembling hands, touching the scorching wooden floor. Droplets of water poured down like rain from her wet head. Her eyes turned red, but Leyla didn't cry. Instead, she continued to glare at Matthias. That wicked man with a pleasant smile. Leyla, who changed her mind after trying to figure out what to say, stood up. Matthias sat on the wooden floor as if he was enjoying his sunbath. He then looked up at her. The thin, white clothes starkly revealed the lines of her body. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. While Matthias's eyes focused on her trembling shoulders, Leyla suddenly shook off the water from her hat. The cold droplets of water hit Matthias's indifferent face. Although Leyla flinched a little, she didn't stop her revenge. After wearing the hat that was still dripping with water, she now brushed off her skirt. Her eyes glistened provocatively at Matthias. "Is it fun?" Matthias slowly swept his face as if he were washing it and opened his mouth. "I'm starting to get a little bored." His laughter quickly disappeared from his stony face. Although Leyla cowered instinctively, she didn't avoid his gaze. "How? What? Why? Are you doing this to me?" "Leyla, your gratitude." Matthias slowly rolled up the sleeves of his wet shirt. "Your gratitude towards your lifesaver." He nonchalantly teased Leyla, who looked back at him in astonishment. "I don't think any of this would have happened if you hadn't thrown my hat into the river." "No." The gap between his eyebrows narrowed. "If you'd patiently eaten your sandwich and left, this wouldn't have happened." Leyla simply blinked. His tone was too calm for it to be a joke. "Nor if you hadn't made the pathetic decision to jump into the river, even though you don't know how to swim." Matthias lightly brushed off the dripping water with the tip of his finger and tilted his head. "Thank you for saving me, Your Grace." Leyla clenched her jaws and bowed. "Uncle Bill. Uncle Bill. Uncle Bill." She once again started her incantation. Again, Matthias ordered as if he was checking the sincerity of her gratitude. "Like a lady." Again, the Duke didn't smile or laugh. "My apologizes, Your Grace, I'm not like the other aristocratic ladies. I'm not even a lady." Leyla's angry words slipped out of her mouth. Matthias silently stared at her without any agitation. "But you have to be a lady in front of me, Leyla." The droplets on the tips of his fingers bounced off Layla's foot. "Whatever you are, I'm still a gentleman." The Duke smiled while quietly staring at Leyla. Leyla grasped her soaked skirt with her white, hardened hands. Just like the graceful lady the Duke had wanted her to be, she gave a courteous bow. The droplets of water from the straw hat brim fell onto the wooden floor of the dock. "Thank you very much for saving my life, Your Grace." Although her body trembled to the point her teeth collided against each other, Leyla lowered her head, enunciating her every word correctly. Matthias gave a pass for her ladylike gratitude with the nod of his chin. "Don't cry, Leyla Lewellin." Leyla tightened her fist. "Don't cry over someone like that, please." Comforting herself, Leyla then straightened her waist, which used to be bent towards the Duke. "Then, I'll go back now. Goodbye, Your Grace." Leyla resolutely turned, leaving behind the silent Matthias. Behind the walking Leyla was a long trail of water droplets falling from the skirt. Her legs were loose, and she nearly fell several times, but Leyla desperately tightened her leg muscles. She clenched her teeth and made her mind that she wouldn't fall today. That she won't be his plaything anymore. Never. Once Leyla was out of Matthias's sight, she now ran. The corners of her eyes were so red that even the hat's shade couldn't hide her eyes. Leyla ran faster and faster, increasing the speed of her running. She saw it by chance one day. He was walking along the forest path with Claudine. The elegant gentleman escorting the alluring lady was just like a scene from a fairy tale or a court novel. When they reached the end of the road, the wind blew off Claudine's hat. Matthias slowly approached the hat and picked it up to give it back to Claudine. His non-urgent gesture was very graceful. By the time Leyla noticed how he always moved that gracefully, the two were out of Layla's sight. With that non-urgent gesture as that day, he had insulted Leyla today. She stopped running after realizing the harsh difference between his attitude towards her and Claudine. The pale-faced Leyla staggered to the grass to throw up the food she forcefully shoved in. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't cry. When the nausea stopped, Leyla went to the shallow stream running through the forest and rinsed her mouth. She felt much better after taking a rest in the tree shade. Leyla wiped her lips with the back of her hand and returned to the path leading to the cabin. She had no more energy left to run, so she trudged her legs along. The damp stocking and skirt got dirtied, but she didn't mind because her appearance was already messy. When the cabin in sight, Leyla gathered up her last energy and kicked the hazel tree fruit off the side of the road. While she watched the fruit roll down, she suddenly realized the fatal mistake she had made. My glasses. Her face crumpled up. The road she looked back on felt far away. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 12. The Crow Gentleman, 1. When he moved the stylus needle, music began to flow out. The aria of an opera carried by the phonograph placed on top of the mahogany cabinet instantly defeated the silence that was filling the reception room of the annex. Matthias changed the frequency a few times to let a different music genre, the waltz, to flow out and then sat back on the sofa. The melody was bright and cheerful. His long fingertips, lightly touching the armrest, slowly tapped along to the beat. The desk clock on the opposite console table indicated it was currently 5 o'clock. Matthias's gaze briefly focused on the lousy arranged rose vase next to the clock and soon turned his head towards the window. The wind got cooler as evening approached. The wind from the river shook his gown before it headed out into the forest. Matthias reached out and opened a small silver box placed at the end of the drawing table. While he picked up a cigarette from the box and lit it up, the waltz song was over. Matthias slowly smoked, listening to the raucous string music that followed. The late afternoon of the summer was boring and still. When the song stopped, Matthias picked up Layla's glasses, which he had carelessly thrown in the tray next to him. Matthias held up the glasses to his face. Her eyes seemed to be pretty bad because the world he saw over the lenses was dizzy. Is that why she always frowned? He suddenly thought of the little child staring at him with a sulky frown. The scrawny, unpretentious girl whose eyes were glistening despite her appearance. The child who was supposed to stay for a brief time had grown in Matthias's world and matured into a woman. The woman's slender face with the thin gold-rimmed glasses overlapped the scrawny girl's face. The woman with the glistening eyes still had that fresh, sweet smell. It was the fragrance of a rose, the flower that filled up Arvis's summer garden. Having let out a long stream of cigarette smoke, Matthias went out to the balcony that stretched towards the river while loosely holding Layla's glasses. His shadow lengthened as he playfully threw up and caught the glasses several times. "Leyla," he whispered in the hot summer. "Leyla Lewellin." The fact that he had to tickle the tip of his tongue in order to fluidly pronounce her name annoyed him. After returning to the reception room, Matthias put her glasses in the drawer of the console table. When he closed the drawer, the memory of the green eyes that he saw over her glasses disappeared. Matthias went to the bathroom and took a long shower. He changed his clothes and waxed his hair. By the time he left the annex to attend dinner, he was again the perfect Duke of Arvis. What if the crow took it again? Bill asked with some jest. Leyla, who was sitting at the table with a serious look on her face, shrugged. Well, I hope not. Just saying. They're the type of birds who go crazy if they see something sparkling. Remember? Your hairpin. Bill burst out laughing. Layla's face hardened by the memory that Bill reminded her of, but soon laughed with him. Uncle Bill had bought Leyla a shiny hairpin on her 13th birthday. It was chosen by Mrs. Mona, who had researched the type of hairpins girls her age liked. Leyla tried to carefully preserve the pin. If Bill hadn't said he'd throw it out if she didn't wear it right away, it might have been asleep in her drawer forever. But on the first day she wore the gift, the pin met its harsh fate. The crow carried away the pin Leyla had briefly placed on the fence in order to take care of the garden. It was an incident that caused Leyla, who used to love all birds, to have a disdain for crows. "If you can't find it, tell me, Leyla." Bill strained his voice as if he was requesting. "You don't have to look like that because I can buy you a new one. Okay? Okay, Uncle." Leyla gladly nodded. "I will." She was able to answer back because she was completely sure her glasses were at the dock, where she had taken them off before diving into the river. However, the next morning when Leyla came out to the riverside, she was devastated. She tried to thoroughly search the dock as well as the surrounding area of the annex, but her glasses were nowhere to be found. The undone apron was still in its place, but only the glasses were gone. She thought the wind must have it blown away, but because of the apron on the dock, she dismissed her thought. She was sure she took off her glasses first and then her apron. There was no way her glasses alone could disappear. No way. Maybe? Leyla snooped around in front of the annex and then shook her head as if it was nonsense. "There's no reason for the Duke to take it." Leyla turned around with her drooped shoulders. She regretted not coming back earlier to pick up her glasses. She was just afraid of running into the Duke. "Is it really you?" Leyla muttered, staring at the crow sitting on the branch. The crow tilted its head several times and soon flew away into the far woods. With a determined face, Leyla clenched her fist. She began to walk with wide steps. She was first going to go back to her cabin, have breakfast, and think again with a clearer mind. The suspect seemed to be one of the two. The crow, or the Duke. The snow-white dove sat by the window. Kyle, who casually turned his head, smiled and opened the window. "Hey, Phoebe." The dove didn't run away even though he had reached his hand out. Kyle naturally pulled the letter from the bird's leg. The mountain dove, Phoebe, was Leyla Lewellin's messenger. Having been obsessed with birds since childhood, she read a book about doves being able to deliver letters, so one day, she had a grand ambition to have a dove of her down. "Come and read on our website, Wuxia World site." "Thanks." "Sure. Go ahead." When Kyle snickered at her ambition, he never dreamed that day would actually come until the ancient, legend-like precursor suddenly flew through his room window. The persistent girl, Leyla Lewellin, had done it. Leyla, who did not give up despite her many failures, managed to train the bird. It was late spring 2 years ago when Phoebe first flew into Kyle's window. He had opened the window and a dove that brought Layla's letter stared at him. It was a pretty dove with shiny white feathers and black eyes. "Hello, Mr. Edmund." Layla's letter brought by the dove that day contained only one short line. But Kyle was able to read many other things. Layla's excitement and her success. Layla's eyes sparkling with joy. "Leyla. My dear friend, Leyla." Doves delivering letters in a world like today. Kyle laughed at the absurdity, but he understood. For Leyla, Phoebe was, so to speak, a telephone. In a cabin with no telephones around, letter-carrying pigeons were quite efficient. But today's letter from Layla's messenger contained tragic news. The letter read that she had lost her glasses. She had to go find her glasses. She couldn't keep their promise to go to the library. And that she was very sorry. After finishing its work, Phoebe left the window while Kyle read the letter with a serious face. Kyle put the folded letter between the thick book that was spread out on the desk and hurried out of his room. "Kyle Edmund. Are you going to Layla's again?" Mrs. Edmund frowned at the sight of her son coming down the stairs, but Kyle silently smiled. "You need to study, Kyle." "I'll do it at Layla's." Kyle left the front door, leaving only a lively answer behind. The shiny silver bicycle glided past Edmund's house. When he entered the Arvis territory, Kyle frantically pedaled as he grew more and more impatient. He wasn't interested in going to the library. He had made the promise just to be with Leyla. He was worried about her. Those were the glasses she bought with her hard work. His heart ached when he thought of Leyla, the fool who saved and earned money by making jam and selling it just because she was worried of being burdensome to Uncle Bill. Kyle?" When the bicycle squealed to a halt, Leyla, who was hanging the laundry, looked at Kyle with a surprised face. "Did you find your glasses?" "No. Not yet." Layla's face grew sullen. "I'll buy you a new one," Kyle blurted out because he was upset to see the depressed Leyla. "Kyle. You? Why?" Leyla replied back with confusion in her eyes. Kyle suddenly realized what he had said. His feelings got the best of him, so he had forgotten what kind of person Leyla was. "Thank you, Kyle, but I can't." Leyla smiled brightly as if to keep him from being embarrassed. "And I really want to find my glasses." Unlike her smiling lips, her eyes were firm. Kyle knew those eyes well. It was the eyes of Leyla Lewellin, the stubborn woman who wouldn't back down no matter what. "I'll find it for sure." Leyla had been stirring the forest for days. The doctor's son was with her. Their vain efforts were so admirable, Matthias pretended not to know. It was quite entertaining to see them search around the innocent bird nests. "Do you really don't know, or are you pretending not to know?" Matthias paused his legs that were climbing the annex stairs and then looked at the vast expanse of the forest along the river. He was about to get bored with their foolishness. He was also getting bored of visiting this place for the past few days, smirking at their search attempts despite his busy schedule. Matthias continued climbing the stairs while slowly sweeping his hair that had been disheveled by the strong wind. Hessen, who followed, took a step back after quietly opening the door. Matthias headed straight to the reception room. Instead of usually sitting on the sofa, he leaned against the window, facing the forest. "Marquis Lindman will arrive around noon today." "Riet?" "His arrival is earlier than scheduled. Madame has instructed me to pay special attention to the luncheon. She asked the master to join if you didn't have any previous appointments scheduled." "Sure. I will." The chiffon curtain that was covering half of the window slowly swelled up with the gust of wind. When the curtain deflated, Matthias's eyes narrowed when he saw the path covered with a tranquil sunlight. Leyla stood under the tree at the end of the road. She was circling around the tree with her hands held together. "Maybe she isn't a complete fool." Matthias silently grinned and he focused his attention to Hessen's reports while the middle-aged maid served him cold lemon water. The clatter of ice in the glass was quite pleasant to hear. When the maid and the butler left after finishing their job, Matthias watched the scenery beyond the window with the long-necked glass cup in his hand. Leyla began to approach the river when the maid and the butler were completely out of sight. Not long after, the doorbell rang out the tranquil annex. Matthias slowly rose from his seat. "Cry, even better if you beg." Chapter 13. A moonlit night, 1. Unlike the day she had angrily left the annex, the Leyla now looked like a gentle, precocious lady. Matthias stared at the gentle Leyla while languidly leaning on the couch. "I'm terribly sorry for this sudden discourtesy, Your Grace." Leyla hesitatingly opened her mouth while she kept her head down in efforts to avoid his gaze. Her dense eyelashes were very long and straight. Her long eyelashes seemed to be a reason why she left a soft impression when she gently lowered her eyes. "Pardon me, but I have a question." Leyla, who had been licking her lips several times, finally managed to open her mouth. But at that moment, the phone started ringing. Matthias slowly stood up to pass by Leyla as she retreated. He picked up the phone. It seemed to be a business call regarding a complicated contract he had to look over. Leyla looked a little surprised when she saw Matthias on the phone. He skillfully led the conversation. Even with his brief smiles and polite way of talking, she could feel the power and dignity that overwhelmed the person on the phone. He looked like the perfect Duke of Arvis that everyone admired. "I mean, no way." The suspicion that the man could have taken her glasses felt ridiculous at the moment. "I feel like I'm doing something useless." Then was it the crow? While judging how many crow's nests there might be in the forest, Leyla silently greeted the Duke, who was on the phone, and was about to leave. He unexpectedly turned to Leyla while holding onto the telephone mouthpiece. "Wait." His short order sounded like someone else's. His voice was quite different from the perfect Duke of Arvis she heard while he was on the phone. Leyla stopped at a strange position. Matthias was focused on his call again as if nothing had happened. Leyla realized another trait of Matthias while watching him. Even at the moment of his social conversation, Duke Herhardt's eyes were calm. His smile was also calm. But his posture was uniformly straight and elegant. Despite the fact the phone caller wasn't able to see him, he didn't lose his posture. Leyla thought perhaps it was a trait that was embedded into his body. After a few more minutes of his call, he went back to the front of the table and made a note of something. Leyla nervously grasped her wriggling hands from behind her back. By the time she suspected that he must have forgotten about her presence, Matthias's eyes finally turned to her. "Tell me what you were going to say." Leyla gently lowered her eyes when Matthias's stare made her uncomfortable. The thing is, my glasses. On the day I jumped into the river, I was wondering if you saw my glasses at the dock. Well, I don't think I've seen it." Matthias slowly stood up from the sofa and started approaching her. I've hidden it." What?" Leyla was so shocked that she raised her head. "My glasses. Did you really hide it? What do you think?" "I don't think he would have done such a thing," Leyla answered with a slight frown. "Why?" Matthias tilted his head as if he was amused. His black hair that slightly shook on his forehead resembled the crow's feather. "Because that's rude." Leyla curled up her feet in order to not back away. After days of searching the crow's nests with Kyle, she managed to muster up her courage and came here. Even though she didn't like Matthias, she could at least communicate with the Duke, unlike the crows. She felt like it would be better to quickly eliminate either one of the two suspects, the crow or the Duke. But she wasn't sure now. She wasn't sure if the Duke, who only increased her confusion with his enigmatic words, was really a person who she can communicate with. The two looked at each other's eyes without saying a word for some time. The moment would have lasted longer if the butler hadn't returned to the annex with an urgent telegram and mail. Leyla headed towards the window with a little blush in her cheeks. After a low conversation with the butler, Matthias obliquely looked at Leyla. His red lips seemed to be slightly tilted, although Leyla wasn't completely sure because of her glasses missing. With all the courage she had, she opened her mouth, but Matthias cut her off by lifting the tip of chin towards the door. It was a concise and cold gesture to announce that there was no room left for Leyla Lewellin. "A bird? What's with your weird hobby all of a sudden?" Riet looked at the cage with a puzzled look. In the beautiful golden cage, there was a golden bird. "Are you now planning to raise a bird and shoot it yourself?" Riet's jokes brought laughter to the people sitting around the mansion suite reception room. Matthias gave a small chuckle. But his answers weren't heard. While Riet added a few more silly words, the servants came in with the champagne. A huge dinner was held at the Herhardt's place to celebrate the gathering of all the relatives who had spent the summer together. Matthias, Claudine, Riet, and other aristocrats of similar ages had moved to the reception room after finishing their dinner. By Claudine's special request, they were in the master suite reception room, the space that Matthias only used. Matthias, who rarely shared his own space, seemed quite generous to his fiancée as gave her his chaste permission. The engagement between Matthias and Claudine was pretty much confirmed by the relatives. It was obvious why Countess Brand visited Arvis every year with her only daughter and how the Herhardt family gave their conspicuous welcome every time the Brand household came to their estate. This engagement surprised none of the relatives. It was as if natural things had come true. They would have been more shocked if Matthias had chosen a different woman. "That bird doesn't seem to know what kind of person Duke Herhardt is." When the bird flew out of the open cage, it sat on Matthias's shoulder. Riet broke into a jolly laughter. "A bird in love with a bird-hunting master. Should I call this foolish or pitiful?" The bird moved over his finger when Matthias reached out his hand. "Claudine, what do you think?" Everyone's eyes were on Claudine after listening to the question Riet threw. "Well, I don't know." Claudine glanced at the singing bird sitting on Matthias's finger. "You could call it a foolish but pitiful bird." Another burst of laughter broke out at her compromise. The atmosphere between the people in the reception room was intimate because they had seen each other for many years. The names everyone knew, the world everyone shared, the same interests everyone had. It was truly a society that only they could enter. "That bird, what's its name?" Claudine asked a friendly question. "If you don't have a name for it yet, would you like me to name it for you? Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. It's not worth your effort, my lady. When Matthias turned his eyes and looked at Claudine, he smiled. His smile seemed the same as before, but it somehow felt subtly different. A bird is just a bird. His answer was heartless in contrast to the soft gaze of the singing bird on his fingers. As expected, the stupid poor bird hissed as he showed his sympathy for the bird. It loves a hunter who doesn't allow to have a name of its own. The group of people laughing and chatting over the champagne didn't leave the suite until it was late at night. Passing by the servants who came in to clean up the reception room, Matthias left the mansion for a night walk alone. His face, no longer smiling, was as still as the night. The trap was laid, so it was time to check. It wasn't a fool, so it would have noticed, but he knew it wouldn't give up. That's why he was sure it'll get caught. Matthias walked through the rose garden. The wind got cooler as he got closer to the river and then through the forest. His steps stopped in front of the annex along the river. The moonlight was white. Entering the annex's reception room, Matthias approached in front of the console table and opened the drawer. The neatly placed glasses glistened, reflecting the moonlight. Holding the glasses as if it was his canary, Matthias laid his tired body on the sofa. What do I want from the bait I set up? Matthias thought while looking at the glasses. He had difficulty answering, but he wasn't impatient. He believed he'll find out once he caught it. The night grew deeper as he repeatedly threw the glasses up and down. It was a moonlit night. It was a crazy act. Leyla was clearly aware. Sneaking into the Duke's annex was something no one with the right sanity would do. Yeah. Let's get some sleep. Leyla, who had been wandering around the room, threw herself onto the bed. She wrapped herself in a thin blanket and tightly closed her eyes. My glasses. But she couldn't fall asleep. Leyla was sure of her decision. Although she knew she was acting ridiculous, she was determined. She needed to get her glasses. Leyla sprang to her feet. She predicted that Matthias couldn't have brought it to his mansion, so she was sure that it was somewhere in the annex. That place was remote and it was near midnight, so Leyla thought it would be fine. The moon today was so bright that the darkness didn't scare her. Yes. It's all right. Leyla opened the door with a convincing murmur. The cabin was filled with still darkness. Uncle Bill's snoring was the only disturbance. While picking up a lace shawl that hung on the door, Leyla hurried out of the cabin. Whenever she had second thoughts, she thought of the countless fruits she had collected and the jam she boiled in order to buy the glasses. It's my glasses anyways. As the glittering shelter river was seen in the distance, Leyla suppressed her anxiety by talking to herself. Her soft blonde hair that went down her waist rippled along to the fast-paced rhythm of her footsteps. But the more I think about it, the Duke is a strange man. Leyla suddenly thought as she walked along the duct that was connected to the annex. Does he like sparkly things like the crow? In the midst of her questioning mixed with vexation, Leyla arrived in front of the annex where her glasses were hidden. She realized that she was in her pajamas but soon shrugged it off because it was the middle of the night and no one was there to see her. Leyla took a deep breath as she took a step forward. As expected, Leyla Lewellin's actions once again didn't go beyond Matthias's expectations. When he heard the footsteps climbing up the stairs coming closer, Matthias's breathing became slower. Even though he had left the door open for easy access, Leyla eventually came in through the hallway window after wandering outside for a long time. She was a girl who didn't deviate from his expectations, but she always gave a little impact. Matthias lay still on the couch and listened to her approach. Leyla's sigh of relief was followed after the hardwood floor creaked smoothly. Matthias silently sneered and lowered his gaze from the ceiling. It wasn't long before Leyla entered the reception room. She initially looked around her surroundings with a stiff stance, and finally took a cautious step forward. She started her searches by the window. Matthias's eyes, already accustomed to the darkness, instantly captured Leyla's figure. The moonlight that flowed through the window shone upon Leyla, who stood in front of the table. By the time Matthias narrowed his eyes, Leyla had moved to her next destination, the cabinet. The skirt wrapped around her slender calves shook along with her footsteps. The white dress made with thin material that distinctively revealed her body line clearly looked like she was in her nightwear. "What do I want from the bait I set up?" Matthias stroked the slender temple of the glasses with his fingers. The cold, smooth texture made his conscience clear. In the meanwhile, Leyla now moved to the front of the console table, which was placed right across the sofa where Matthias lay. Matthias looked back towards Leyla's back, which was illuminated by the moonlight. "That woman." Matthias acknowledged the answer to his question. The reason why he endlessly waited while setting up this pathetic trap. In order to have that woman. That woman, Leyla Lewellin, who was no longer a little girl. "Are you looking for this?" Matthias steadily shook the glasses in his hand and opened his lips. Leyla, who was just about to touch the console table's drawer, quickly turned around. She looked like was about to faint. She staggered backwards while her trembling hands covered her mouth. Matthias slowly raised himself up. As he sat, leaning against the sofa, the moonlight glistened over his face, which had been in the dark all along. The two persons' eyes met in the moonlit night. "Cry, even better if you beg." Chapter 14. Desired that woman, 1. In his sight, Leyla was trembling helplessly. Even though she often pretended to act brave, she was always easily frightened. She had been like that since childhood. Matthias started walking towards Leyla while he recollected his memory of the young girl. He stopped a few steps away from Leyla as her eyes gradually turned to his hand. To be exact, to the glasses he was holding in his hand. "I'm sorry." Leyla barely opened her lips. Her eyes were filled with anger, but her apology was polite. "I didn't think you'd be here. I'm very sore." "What if I didn't have it? Did you think it was okay to sneak in?" Matthias tilted his head to look at Leyla. Every time she blinked, her eyes progressively got redder. Even though she looked like she was about to cry, her eyes were still steady. "Like a thief?" Matthias sneered with his low voice. Leyla's blushing cheeks were visibly seen even in the dark. "I just wanted to get back what was rightfully mine." "Ah. This?" Leyla's cheeks flushed harder when he lifted her glasses. When Matthias looked closer at Leyla's face, her ears were even beginning to turn red. "Yes." Her replies to his questions were quite fearless. "My glasses that you had." "Even though you're shaking that much." Matthias headed to the window with the glasses still in his hand. It was the same window that he had thrown her hat over. No. Leyla, who was blankly watching, turned pale as she rushed after him. "Give it back. Please." The lace shawl that had covered Leyla's shoulder fell to the floor. Leyla hurriedly raised her arms to cover the deeply cut, V-neck pajamas. "Isn't it kind of hilarious that you're making a big deal over your nightwear when you've already thoroughly seen my whole body?" Matthias now scoffed at Leyla. Her blush had reddened down to the nape of her neck. That was inevitable." The frightened Leyla shook her head. "It's not what I wanted, so I had no choice." "Did you think I wanted it?" "What? Oh. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it like that." Leyla hastily picked up the shawl and covered her shoulders and her chest. Her half-knocked-out expression was fairly amusing that Matthias softly chuckled. "Why are you acting like a lady all of a sudden? You said you weren't a lady." "Whatever I am, the Duke is still a gentleman." Her refusal of losing to his words was provocative but still respectful. Matthias chuckled once again. "Well." When his chuckling stopped, Matthias's voice dropped a little more lower. "I don't know, Leyla. Maybe I'm not a gentleman." "Oh, no," Leyla urgently shouted as she firmly tied the end of her shawl. "The Duke is a gentleman." "Really?" "Yes. You're the best gentleman in the Berg Empire." "Your appraisal is quite generous." "That's what everyone who knows you would think." "Aren't your thoughts different?" "No." "Yes." Although she wanted to agree, she held back her true thoughts by vigorously shaking her head. "No way." Leyla decided to sell her soul for her glasses tonight. "So, Your Grace, please give it back." She was so upset that tears were about to fall, but Leyla begged again. "It's very important and precious to me." She bowed her head and suffered the humiliation. Leyla felt like she could kick all the stones in the forest to release her pent-up rage, but Leyla knew how much of a disadvantage she was currently in. If he put his mind to it, the Duke could have driven her into a thief. He could have thrown her glasses into the river beyond the window. All those actions that were simple to him were fatal to Leyla, so she had to endure. Matthias approached the determined Leyla. As he threw the glasses up and down again, the gap between the two narrowed. They were now at a distance where they were close enough to feel each other's body temperature. Leyla glanced up in surprise. Matthias's eyes that looked down upon her were deep and tranquil. It was like the bottomless river. The huge, cold river that had engulfed her on that hot afternoon where all this misfortune began. Leyla was immersed in her thoughts when all of a sudden, her vision, which had been blurry, suddenly became clear. Leyla slowly realized that Matthias had put on her glasses for her. His hands that covered her cheeks were soft and hot like the sun-heated sand. His face was distinctively clear, yet everything else surrounding him was cloudy. The flustered Leyla tried to avoid his eyes, but Matthias drew her attention by applying a little force to his hands. Why? She wanted to ask, but a strange and fearful sensation overwhelmed Leyla. It was then, when Matthias's fingers started caressing her lips. His relaxed fingertips stopped in between the crevice of her lip. His frustrated sigh tickled Leyla's forehead. His breath was also soft and hot, like the touch of his fingers. While directly staring into Leyla's eyes, Matthias fondled the wet, soft skin that was inside her lower lip. His fingertip deeply moved in and out of her mouth, that the end of his fingernail almost brushed her lower teeth. Leyla, who had long forgotten to run away, innocently endured his gaze and his touch. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. Matthias slowly closed his eyes by the time Leyla was about to cry over his incomprehensible, strange act. The hands that had grasped her cheeks gently gained strength but then was let loose. Leyla staggered back when his hands finally released her face. She was now able to properly breathe after being tense at his grip. Leyla's body gingerly trembled as she gasped for breath. In the meantime, Matthias had opened his blue eyes. It was the crystalline blue eyes that had shamed and frightened Leyla. Duke Herhardt, who had been staring at Leyla for a long time, quietly ordered, "Go on." Leyla couldn't remember what had happened after she left the annex. She said goodbye, turned around, and walked away. But all that memory was vague. Leyla realized she was already standing at the end of the forest road when she heard the cries of the grass bugs, felt the cool wind, and saw her own shadow walking under the moonlight. Leyla headed for the cabin, still dazed. She didn't vent her anger on the stones and the tree branches, nor did she run away. She just walked. Her slower-than-usual pace was as weightless as a ghost. Leyla drew water from the pump that was located in the corner of the yard and washed her lips. She unconsciously rubbed her lips until it was swollen and crimson red. Although she felt like her skin was about to peel off, the water had still failed to wash away her strange feelings. Leyla's face, her shawl, and the front of her nightwear were soaked with cold water by the time she quietly returned to her room. Without even thinking of drying them, Leyla sat at the edge of her bed. She didn't know what had happened, but Leyla was sure for one thing: she didn't want to run into him ever again. The canary that was quietly sitting in its cage flew towards Matthias at the snap of his fingers. Matthias stretched out his hand towards the bird while he languidly leaned against the window frame. The canary naturally sat on his finger. Its clipped wings had grown long enough for it to fly a little farther. It needed to have its wings cut again, but he didn't feel the need to cut it as short as before. Matthias looked down the window while listening to the canary singing. The gardener, Bill Remmer, was in the middle of his job. Leyla Lewellin, who had been helping him from time to time, was nowhere in sight for several days. She was gone the day after the night she went to find her glasses. Leyla desperately started to avoid him. Matthias wore a scarlet-red hunting jacket after returning the canary to its cage. He desired her. Matthias now clearly knew what this emotion was. That woman, Leyla. He desired her. There was no reason to deny that fact anymore. Leyla Lewellin grew up to be a beautiful woman. Beautiful enough to provoke a man. But Matthias knew this kind of desire was bound to disappear shortly after. Do I need to leave a stain in my life just to satisfy that desire? That night, with Leyla in front of him, Matthias thought and thought again. And he concluded, no, Leyla Lewellin wasn't worth the trouble and his desire for the woman was within his control. Then why? He released Leyla that night. But if she had acted like this after he had set her free, then he had no choice. 5. I've prepared your hunting session, Master. Hessen quietly approached. Nodding his head, Matthias took the gun Hessen had handed him and left the bedroom. Did something happen? Kyle worriedly asked Leyla. Leyla, who was gluing the petals of a well-dried flower into her notebook, calmly looked up and faced him. No. Layla's unhesitant voice was bright as usual. Do I look that way? Leyla lowered her voice and whispered as she wrinkled her eyes. Kyle somehow felt a burning sensation around his neck when he saw her expression. You've been stuck in the cabin these days. It's strange. Kyle calmly shrugged. Leyla blankly blinked a few times and soon regained her bright face. Her lips left a faint smile as her eyes brilliantly twinkled. Now that you've found your glasses, you should travel around more. But it seems like you're doing the opposite now. Kyle stared at Leyla as he rested his chin on his hand. She blandly smiled and started to meticulously write down the places and the features of the flower petals she found in her notebook. Leyla usually drew and pasted unfamiliar flower petals to her notebook and took it to the library to search for their names. Kyle always came along with her to see the smile Leyla would make when she found out the names of the flower petals. Leyla was a child who wanted to know the names of all the birds and flowers in the world. Kyle loved that geeky side of her. 4. Leyla carefully covered the notebook after lightly pressing it with a piece of blotting paper to prevent the ink from smudging. The returned glasses glimmered on her small face. Want to take a walk? To that tree you like, the one that stands in front the river? No. Leyla briefly replied as soon as Kyle had finished his sentence. Didn't you always go there? Why? Did you see something scary in the woods again? It's not like that. And I can't go into the forest today anyways. Why? Ah, is today the Duke's hunting day? Leyla nodded after pushing the note to the end of the table. Not long after, there was a sound of horseshoes coming from a distance. Wow. That's awesome. Kyle quickly ran in front of the window and admired. Duke Herhardt and his group of men were about to enter the forest through a path beside the cabin. The hound dogs were leading the way, followed by 5 young men on horseback. Leyla glanced out of the window along with Kyle. The Duke was riding a glossy horse with dark brown fur today. His red jacket and sparkling shotgun caught her eye. But of course, Leyla, I don't hunt. I won't hunt for the rest of my life. Kyle suddenly changed his expression after admiring the Duke. At that moment, Duke Herhardt had turned his head towards the hut. Even though Leyla was already hiding behind the curtains, she was startled and backed away from the window. For the past 10 days, Leyla tried her best to evade him. She didn't go near the river and she didn't even take a stroll into the forest. She felt apologetic towards Uncle Bill because he had recently gone out to manage the garden all alone. She only helped when the Duke was out of the estate, and when he returned, she briskly left the garden. She was planning to endure her inconvenient actions until the end of this summer. When autumn came, Matthias was going to get engaged and leave for the capital city. Then, Arvis was going to be at peace again. Do you not feel well? Do you want to come over to my house? Kyle anxiously asked while looking at Layla's pale complexion. No, Kyle. I'm fine. Leyla shook her head and sat back on her seat that faced the dinner table. It'll be over by evening anyways. The moment she carelessly opened her book, shots rang out. It was followed by the barking of the hounds and the running of the horses. With her fist clenched, Leyla turned the pages of her book that she couldn't read properly. She thought she had no choice but to go to the woods this evening. There were many poor birds to bury. Cry. Even better if you beg. Chapter 15. Friendly Hunting. 1. After sending his party first, Matthias pulled up his horse in the middle of a wide road between the woods. When he took off his hat, the tangled hair draped down his forehead. The forest, which was swept away by the bloody disturbance, felt more tranquil than usual. Today's hunt was quite enjoyable. Matthias hit every target he aimed at, and each moment was as thrilling as ever. But he somehow felt unsatisfied because of that one bird that had desperately attempted to fly away. While looking towards the direction of the cabin, Matthias slowly turned his horse. The little girl who lived in his hunting grounds came out of the woods crying when the hunt was over and had buried the dead birds. He still remembered her actions because it was so absurd. Then what about that woman who is no longer a young girl? Brooding his curious interest, Matthias aimed his gun at the little bird resting at the edge of the branch. Bang! With an upbeat shot, the bird dropped to the floor. Matthias steadily motioned his horse to move as he left behind the prey he hit. Once. And then once again. Aiming and firing, Matthias headed for the evening forest. One by one, the blood-stained birds fell along the road. I hate him. Leyla dug a hole and repeated those words every time she buried each and every bird. I hate the Duke's atrocious hobby. I really hate it. Wiping her sweaty forehead, Leyla swallowed down her sorrows. She thought she was almost at the end when just a few meters away, another bloody bird was there lying down. Leyla grabbed her shovel and approached the bird. She didn't want to blame the act of killing an animal. Uncle Bill had also hunted for food and Leyla raised livestock. But it was hard to understand why the Duke killed for entertainment and thoughtlessly left his hunt behind. When will this summer be over? With a long sigh, Leyla prayed that her favorite season would quickly come to an end as she buried another bird. It was a red-crowned bird with a beautiful pattern. Leyla suddenly felt something strange after she had already entered deep into the evening forest. Duke Herhardt enjoyed hunting and Leyla buried those birds he hunted down every year. But somehow, Leyla never had any previous memories of making a regular sequence of tombs. It felt like she was creating a pathway made up of dead birds. Should I turn around now? Leyla ceased when she sensed an ominous feeling. The sky she looked up was blazing red. As she turned her gaze from the sunset down beyond the bush of shrubs, she saw him. Duke Herhardt, who was sitting on the cut tree trunk, stared back at her. Leyla almost stumbled as her mind went blank. He greeted her in a carefree way. Hello, Leyla. Matthias von Herhardt's voice was as smooth as the feathers of the birds he shot and killed. By the way, Matthias is quite late. I think the people who went out with him are already back. Leyla von Herhardt's eyes slanted while she put down her card. The card game she was playing was getting boring. She wanted to start dinner early but Matthias hadn't returned from the hunting grounds yet. He said he'll take a walk in the woods. Claudine answered with a friendly smile. Her expression was unlike that of a person who had just lost the game. The ladies, who were well aware it was her deliberate defeat, looked at Claudine with a pleasing smile. The next Duchess of Arvis was sharp and had courtesy as well as grace. Claudine knew she was greatly praised between the aristocratic ladies. Matthias sure loves that forest. Leyla von Herhardt lightly rang the bell and the maid began to organize the table. The bored ladies who sat around the reception table enjoyed a simple snack and chatted. They chatted about the most obvious stories with the most formality. Oh, Claudine. Why don't you invite your friends and open a party? Claudine's eyes went wide open at Leyla von Herhardt's recommendation. Me? Here in Arvis you'll be bored dealing with us every day, so don't you need a change of heart? No. Not at all. Why are you so surprised? I was just kidding, Claudine. Leyla's relaxed, smiling face was so young and beautiful, it was hard to believe that she was the mother of an engaged son. She resembled Matthias. Although the Duchess Leyla von Herhardt was praised by the people of the empire for her time-honored beauty, she had failed to win her husband's love. When Claudine thought about Leyla's tragic love life, she believed women who were obsessed with love were ridiculous. Matthias's predecessor had a mistress like any other man in his position, but he didn't cause any trouble for his next successor by bringing in an illegitimate child. Even though they didn't love each other, the Duke and Duchess of Arvis respected each other and remained faithful to their duties. There were no meaningless greed or hope that gnawed out the calm household. Claudine had hoped for the same relationship with Matthias. You don't have to feel pressured, Claudine. Think of it as a rehearsal. We'll also have fun if the mansion is crowded with young people. Elise's smile had gotten much brighter. Don't you ladies think so too? Everyone in the room knew that her question was not actually asking for their opinion. The Duchess is truly generous and caring. Countess Brandt praised Elise. Soon, other ladies joined by making complimentary remarks with some exaggeration added. Claudine shyly smiled as she gently lowered her head. She was thinking of the names of friends she had wanted to invite until she drew her eyes to the window. That girl came into mind when she saw the forest beyond the sunset garden. Leyla, the poor orphan who lived in that forest. She was well-mannered and very mindful of her own circumstances, but she was still somewhat arrogant. May I invite Leyla? Claudine's cheerful question raised the eyebrows of the ladies. You mean the orphan the gardener raises? Yes. That girl, Leyla Lewellin. Hey, Claudine. The embarrassed Countess Brandt glared at Claudine, but Claudine was undisturbed. That pitiful girl must have never attended a formal party before. I want to give Leyla an unforgettable experience. Claudine didn't lose her ladylike courtesy and dignity even when she made those imposing remarks. After hearing your words, it does indeed make sense. Come and read on our website Wuxia World site. Thanks. A satisfied smile was on Duchess Norma Katerina von Herhardt's face, who had been watching Claudine this entire time. Do as you please, Claudine. Leyla looked back at the path of buried birds. When she turned her head and examined the Duke, there was only one conclusion that she reached. Crazy person. There were no other words to explain this situation. Leyla's bloody gloves were filled with sweat. Her heart began to throb with rage mixed with fear. Run away. That was what she could only think of, and was about to return to the cabin when she heard his voice. Leyla. His expression was impassive while he steadily pronounced her name. Leyla Lewellin. The name he quietly intoned sounded like a song. Leyla used the shovel in her hand as a cane to straighten her posture. She firmly closed her lips and applied strength to both her legs. There was no use running away. As long as he put his mind to it, the Duke could easily catch Leyla. Her mind became clear and cold. Leyla raised her twitching eyes and met his gaze. The sound of the forest swaying in the wind rose while the quiet stares remained. Continue. Matthias broke the silence first. You should do your job. On the side of the bushes he indicated with his eyes, there lay a bird that seemed to be the last of his hunt. Leyla plodded up to the bird. There was a red thread tied to the bloody bird's ankle. It was the thread Leyla had tied to the baby birds who hatched near the Shelter River last year. Leyla dug a hole without a word and buried the bird. She was now used to her actions because of that beautiful bird slaughterer. That thread. Did you tie it? He asked while observing. Yes. Why? I wanted to notice the birds that left their nest to migrate. When they ever came back, Leyla answered while patting the soil. I didn't want this kind of reunion. As she felt a shortness of breath, Leyla saw Duke Herhardt's nonchalant face. Do you want to criticize me? He asked while sitting cross-legged. At that moment, the mockery that grazed past his lips made Layla's patience run out. I can't refuse to say no. What's the problem? His eyebrows frowned. I only hunted my birds, in my territory, and in my hunting grounds. But the birds don't know. Think of Uncle Bill. Leyla finally opened her mouth despite the repeated words in her head. For the birds, it's just a forest. A place where they are born and raised. It's also a place where they would want to come back after their migration. Do I need to bother understanding them? Not really, but... Leyla took off her bloody garden gloves and steadied her breath. You don't have to hunt them down so cruelly. In order to let those words come out of her mouth, she had mustered a lot of courage. There was a belated regret that came after, but the Duke showed no displeasure or anger. The strange calmness made Leyla feel more suffocated. Leyla Lewellin, the woman who knows the birds' hearts well. Matthias opened his mouth after a long period of silence. What the hell do you think hunting is? What? Do you want me to do some kind of friendly hunting? His ridicule clawed out her heart. Leyla endured his insult by simply twisting her skirt. I'm sorry. I've said something presumptuous. Please forgive my disrespect. Why do you like birds so much? I don't think it'll be an interesting story for you. Leyla lowered her eyes because she didn't want to see him anymore. The Duke stood in silence. Now that I've finished my work, I'll get going. She bowed deeply as he still remained hushed. Leyla relievedly turned her body. And just when she was about to take a step forward, a bitter shot rang out. Leyla swiftly turned around with a ghastly expression. The Duke had fired a shot towards the end of a tree branch and was looking at her with a gun in his hand. Another bloody bird lay in between him and Leyla. What to do, Leyla? The Duke sat back on the tree trunk as if nothing had happened. I don't think your job has finished yet.